It was a rainy night, and it was pouring. I huddled under the bridge, sitting against the wall, with a broken bowl and a dirty old banknote in front of me. This was my entire property. Who would have thought that a few days ago, I was just an ordinary office worker? And now, I, David, have become a beggar who is laughed at by others. A petite figure caught my attention. She was standing by the bridge. Her clothes were soaked, but her eyes were terrifyingly calm. The next second, she jumped into the surging river. Fuck, don't jump. I rushed out and jumped into the river without hesitation. The water was freezing cold, but I dragged her to the shore with all my might. When she opened her eyes, her empty gaze pierced me. "Why did you save me?" she asked softly. I was stunned. "You shouldn't die, because I'm also living a miserable life," I said, pointing to the dilapidated little bridge hole behind me. But at least I didn't give up living. The girl trembled slightly, with a complicated look in her eyes. "Can I live with you? 2 yuan for a bottle of mineral water? You are robbing me." I stood in front of the counter of the convenience store, my face full of anger, but I could do nothing about it. My coat was too dirty to look at, and my slippers were worn out, but the contempt in their eyes was more piercing than my shabby appearance. I forced out a sentence of, "I won't buy it," and turned to leave. Behind me, I heard the mockery of the clerk and the boss. "You have hands and feet, but you still beg on the street. You deserve it." I knew they were talking about me, but my steps became heavier. The corner of the city is my home. A cold wall, a worn-out bowl. In the bowl lies a dirty $1 bill. This is all I have. Who would have thought that I was an ordinary office worker a few days ago? Before the time travel, I lived a predictable life. Going from work to home, from home to work, a straight line, mechanical and boring. Occasionally, on vacation, I would stay in the internet cafe and immerse myself in the virtual world. At least the life in the game was a little exciting. That day, a dazzling white light suddenly flashed across the computer screen, piercing my vision like a sharp blade. I didn't even have time to struggle before I was sucked into the unknown abyss. When I woke up, I found myself becoming the me of this city, a beggar and a former cerebral palsy patient. I waited for the system to come with great anticipation, but found that it was just a ding-ding decoration. There were no resources, no plugins, and even no explanation. This sky-crushing start made me lose hope. Yes, the protagonists in time travel novels are all glorious, but reality slapped me hard in the face. Every day, I survived by the hustle and bustle of the city and the pity of passersby. Even 3 meals a day became a luxury. It was even worse on rainy days. I hid in a corner, my hair soaked, my clothes sticking to my body, and I was so miserable that even beggars didn't want to approach me. However, fate played a trick on me. On such a gloomy day, I met her. It was raining heavily that day. I was walking across the bridge crouching, but my eyes were attracted by a girl. She was standing in the rain, her clothes were soaked, but she didn't look embarrassed, but like an elf. So beautiful that it made people feel distressed. But the next second, her figure trembled, and she actually jumped down. "Fuck, don't jump," I screamed in shock, feeling mixed emotions. Should I save her or stand aside and watch? In this fateful choice, my life seemed to have ushered in a new turning point. The sound of raindrops hitting the bridge, along with the violent beating of my heart, seemed to urge me to act. I stared at the head that loomed in the distance, and was so nervous that I could hardly breathe. "Fuck, everything happens to me," I cursed under my breath, but jumped into the cold river without hesitation. The rain and river water mixed together, freezing cold, but I didn't care. At that moment, only one thought was circling in my mind. Save her, don't hesitate. Despite the turbulent water, I swam towards her with all my strength. When I grabbed her arm and dragged her to the shore, the weight of my heart finally fell to the ground. But when I saw her frail body and the glaring scars on her body, my heart felt like it was being tugged at again. The moment she woke up, her empty eyes deeply hurt me. The tear that slid down her cheek seemed to silently tell of the suffering she had experienced. Especially when I mentioned the word home, her tears flowed even more violently. "Would you like to come with me?" I asked her cautiously. The girl didn't answer, but just nodded slightly. The rain was still falling, and I didn't dare to delay any longer. I carried her on my back and took her back to my temporary residence, a simple hut under a bridge. Don't despise me. My home may be simple, but at least it can shelter us from the wind and rain. I tried to speak in a relaxed tone. However, looking at her soaked clothes, I couldn't help but grab my spare towel and my only set of clean clothes. "You change inside." I pointed to the small room, and turned to leave. But she grabbed the corner of my clothes and looked at me with her helpless eyes. She didn't trust me, or rather, she was afraid of everything strange. I tried to make myself look more reliable. Don't worry, I'll wait outside. No one will hurt you. After saying that, I stepped outside, but mixed emotions surged in my heart. Not long after, she changed her clothes and came out. At that moment, I was stunned. Although she was thin, she was like the morning light after the rain, revealing a pure and untainted purity. But I quickly suppressed this strange feeling and warned myself in my heart. Calm down. She is still a child. At night, the sound of rain was still dripping. I put her on the bed and sat outside to keep watch. The rain washed the streets and also washed my heart. This strange world is not friendly to me, but today's experience makes me feel that I may not be alone. The next morning, I heard a noise in the house. I pushed the door open and saw her holding her head with both hands, looking at me with a wary look. I stopped and asked tentatively, "What's wrong? Did you have a nightmare?" She didn't answer, but there was a hint of fear and pain in her eyes. The sunshine after the rain shone under the bridge, and the fresh air made me feel a little more relaxed. I had just recovered from the tennis farce, and I was trying to explain, fearing that the girl in front of me would misunderstand me as a pervert. "I'm sorry. I really didn't expect it to fall." I hurried to explain, but she just looked at me quietly. There was no anger in her eyes, but instead a hint of tenderness. Her eyes made me feel more and more uneasy. Am I really considered a pervert? My mind was in a mess, and I quickly added, "Don't worry, I didn't enter the room last night." "You slept alone." "I know," she responded softly. This voice was as gentle as the spring breeze, and it melted me instantly. My heart trembled. Fuck, could this be love? Her answer made me feel relieved, but I noticed the scars on her body. Those shocking marks seemed like a silent accusation. I said tentatively, "Why don't you go wash up? Although the water is not pure, it is enough." The girl nodded, picked up the towel, and walked towards the riverbank. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned around to clean up the house, but I saw an ID card on the bed. The name and photo on it stunned me. Eve, October 18th, 2005, 18 years old. Looking at her childish photo and age, I almost covered my chest. It's over. It really is one of the three major illusions in life. When she came back after washing up, I quickly handed her ID card back. "This is what you left behind." She took it with a calm expression, but when she heard the word home, a hint of sadness appeared in her eyes. "I don't have a home." Her voice was so soft that it was almost inaudible, but it pierced my heart like a blunt knife. I was stunned. I thought she was just in trouble, but I didn't expect that she had no place to stay. "Well, do you want to stay here for a few days?" I asked tentatively, pointing to the simple wooden house. Although it's simple, it can shelter you from the wind and rain. She was stunned for a moment, then nodded, with a faint light flashing in her eyes. Looking at her eyes filled with hope, I felt a little warm in my heart. "Okay, wait a minute, I need to tidy up a bit." I opened the tattered iron box, and inside was all the belongings I had begged for. 38 yuan and a coin. "This is all my fortune." I sighed. "I have to find a good barber. At least people won't think I'm a homeless person." Having said that, I noticed two words engraved on the back of the coin. Eve. I looked up at the girl. She was standing in the sun, her slender figure exuding an indescribable beauty. Suddenly, I understood that the coin was left by her, perhaps unintentionally, or perhaps as a mark. "It seems that I owe you one," I thought silently in my heart, then picked up all my belongings and set out, ready to tidy myself up so that the girl in front of me would no longer be on guard against me. However, when I walked into the downtown, the looks from the people around me made me feel uncomfortable. My shabby clothes and messy hair made me feel out of place in this bustling city. Barber shop. Let's start from the beginning. I gritted my teeth and walked into a barber shop that looked pretty good. The waiter who came towards me was very enthusiastic, but before long, the smile froze on his face. I smelled the peculiar smell on my body and couldn't help but feel embarrassed. As expected, the waiter's eyes began to become subtle. Although he was still enthusiastic, he couldn't hide his disgust. "How much is a haircut?" I asked bravely, and the waiter quickly replied, 50. No bargaining. Hearing the price, I was so angry that I shouted, 50? Why don't you just go grab it? The roar instantly attracted the attention of the whole audience. I held Eve's hand tightly and walked through the crowd at a fast pace. The hustle and bustle of the street was gradually left behind us until we hid in a secluded alley. I breathed a sigh of relief and leaned against the wall, panting. This clerk changes his expression so quickly. He was as polite as an angel 1 second, and he was like a completely different person the next second. I complained while secretly glancing at Eve. She looked down at me holding her hand, her eyes complicated and dazed. That quiet yet soft feeling made me feel a little uncomfortable, so I quickly let go of her hand and asked tentatively, "I'm sorry, I was too impatient just now. Did I hurt you?" Unexpectedly, she gently took my hand again and whispered, "Just like this, it's good." The voice was so small that it was almost blown away by the wind, but it made my head buzz. "Don't think too much. Don't think too much. Calm down," I screamed in my heart, trying to suppress the inexplicable throbbing. But her hands were soft and small, and the warmth coming from them was impossible for me to ignore. Looking around, I suddenly saw a sign with white, red, and blue lights spinning not far away. That's the light used in barbershops. I pointed excitedly and said, "There's always a way out. Let's go there." The barbershop was small and so shabby that one wondered if it could still be in business. Through the glass door, I saw the owner lying next to the only barber booth, snoring. His snoring was so loud that he didn't notice our presence at all. "Boss, business is coming." I knocked on the sofa next to me, but the guy just mumbled in a daze, "Beef. I don't eat beef," and went back to sleep. I couldn't help but raise my voice. "Boss, wake up. We're gonna get rich." Finally, he sat up with a start and shouted in shock, "Don't kill me. Don't kill me." After opening his eyes, he stared at me for a few seconds and suddenly shouted, "It's you." "Me?" I was confused and had no idea what he was talking about. He smiled and patted my shoulder, then went into the kitchen to get some food. He put it in front of me and sighed. "Young man, I haven't seen you for a year. You've recovered well." Hearing him say that, I was even more confused. Recovery? When did it happen? My mind was full of question marks until he mentioned that I saved his life a year ago and helped him find the police. But the question is, wasn't the original owner cerebral palsy? "Don't think too much, have a cup of tea, get a haircut, and I'll give you a makeover." The boss didn't say much, but his attitude was enthusiastic, and he quickly picked up the scissors. 2 hours later, I was stunned in front of the mirror. I looked like a completely different person in the mirror. My hair was neat and tidy, and my face was clean and bright. Although my clothes were still old, I looked much more energetic. I couldn't help but sigh. "I'm so handsome. I really want to marry myself." Eve stood by and watched for a long time. Suddenly, her eyes lit up and she whispered 2 words, "Beautiful." Her voice was very soft, but I caught it instantly. Looking at her clear eyes, I suddenly felt a little satisfied. "Thank you." I smiled and touched her head, but then I thought about my current predicament. I can barely support myself, and I still want to take care of her? It's just wishful thinking. But the next second, Eve took out a card from her pocket and handed it to me. "This is rich." I was stunned for a moment and shouted in my heart, "Rich woman? This kind of luck is too fake." Suppressing my inner shock, I gently asked, "How much money is in there?" She answered cautiously, "500." She tilted her head and looked at me. "Is that enough?" The $500 lay quietly in my hand. I stared at it, feeling mixed emotions. Eve looked up at me, as if expecting my reaction, but I sighed deeply. It would be great if I was an ordinary person after traveling through time. I muttered to myself, "But I'm a beggar. I have to rely on the system to beg. This is really a prank of God." Eve misunderstood my sigh. She tugged at the corner of my clothes and said in a voice as low as a mosquito, "I'm sorry. Is it not enough?" These words pierced my heart at once. "It's not because of this," I explained quickly, my eyes full of helplessness and apology. How could such a young child feel that she has a responsibility? How could I let her bear such emotions? All right, stop being so sentimental." The boss nearby couldn't stand it any longer and pulled out 200 yuan from his worn-out wallet. "Consider this my way of repaying you for the favor you've done me." The boss threw the money into the broken bowl I carried with me without saying anything. The system's crisp voice rang out. "Points plus 200, current points 238. "Hey, thank you." I scratched my head, feeling a little complicated. I didn't expect that after traveling to the beggar system, I could still make a living by relying on points. "Wait, I have something for you." The boss ran back mysteriously like an NPC and took out a few new sets of clothes from the inner room and handed them over. "Put on these clothes, and you'll look like a human being." I took the clothes, and a warm feeling surged through my heart. Thank you, boss. I really don't know how to repay you. The boss waved his hand and smiled nonchalantly. If you want to thank me, don't act like a beggar anymore. After leaving the barber shop, I held Eva's hand and walked home. She murmured security in a low voice, which made me laugh and cry, so I had to let her hold my hand. On the way, the setting sun was shining all over the earth. Spots of light were shining through the leaves, and the sun coated the whole world with a layer of golden gauze. I couldn't help but sigh in my heart that I had never paid attention to such beautiful scenery before I traveled through time. It seems that today is not too bad, right? I looked down and asked Eve. She nodded slightly, and a faint smile appeared on her face, like the sky after the rain. After returning home, I opened one set of clothes and tried them on, then took out another set from the closet and handed it to Eve. Put it on. It will be cleaner this way. She shook her head, seemingly unwilling to change, so I directly invited her to leave. Change before you come in. I closed the door and took a deep breath. Her eyes make me, a single old man, feel so stressed. I'm gonna go crazy if she continues like this. After a while, she came out wearing a white t-shirt with a cute little cat printed on it. The cotton clothes were soft and fit her well, making her look fresh and natural. I stared at her for a while and couldn't help laughing. This little kitten is very cute. The boss has good taste. She pursed her lips and whispered thank you, which warmed my heart. At this moment, I suddenly realized that although life was still difficult, at least it was a little different. If I continued walking with her, maybe I could change something? Eve lowered her head, her cheeks slightly red, and even her eyes flickered when she looked at me. I couldn't help but ask, "What's wrong with you? Are you feeling uncomfortable?" She replied softly, "No, no." Her voice was as soft as a mosquito, and it made me feel pity. "I'm glad you're okay. If you feel uncomfortable, be sure to tell me." I sighed softly, then turned around to prepare for today's big plan, fishing. This is the top priority in life. In the corner under the bridge, I found a wooden stick with a sharp tip, which is the magic weapon I usually use to catch fish. I turned around and said to Eve, "You just wait on the shore. I can do it alone." Just as I was about to get into the water, I suddenly realized that without seasoning, the fish would definitely not taste good. I touched my pocket and asked, "Do you want to go to the store with me? I can buy something by the way." "Okay." Eve nodded obediently. So we packed up, took a bag, and walked to the store about a kilometer away. On the way, I habitually tried to wake up the system. "Oh, this broken system," I complained in my heart. After traveling through time, I have neither a golden finger nor can I turn over. So just let me be an ordinary person. As I was muttering to myself, a ding sound suddenly rang in my mind. A blue screen of light unfolded in front of me, and 3 options appeared on it. Option 1. Consume all points to obtain the wisdom I function, and you can only be a wanderer. Those who violate the rules will die. Option 2. Get hit by a car and die immediately. Option 3. Get struck by lightning in the rain. Fuck, can I choose this? I almost laughed out of anger, cursing as I clicked on the first one. Then everything in front of me began to change, and lines of descriptions of item information appeared in my sight. I looked at Eve's clothes, and a subtitle instantly appeared. White t-shirt, cotton, comfortable and breathable, suitable for people with delicate skin. I immediately became interested, and my mood was inexplicably lifted. Finally, it works, ha ha ha. What's wrong with you? Eve pulled my hand and looked at me with a puzzled look. I blushed and covered it up. It's okay. Let's go. The store is almost there. Arriving at the store, I pushed open the door and saw a girl lazily lying on a rocking chair, browsing her phone, with a fan slowly spinning above her head, blowing her hair. I cleared my throat and asked, "Boss, where are the condiments?" She lazily pointed at the shelf. I searched for a long time and finally found the barbecue seasoning and cumin powder. When I checked out, she joked, 100 in total. I was so scared that I almost jumped up. "Is this seasoning made of gold?" She laughed. "I'm just kidding, 30 is enough." I took out some loose cash and handed it to her, muttering, "What's wrong with cash? Cash is the wisdom of our ancestors." After we came out of the store, Eve held my hand again. I looked down at her, unable to describe my feelings. The summer breeze blew gently, and I felt a little less lonely. It's nice to have a little thing to keep me company. I laughed at myself and walked towards the shelter. Along the way, I was thinking about how to make this simple place more like a home. Back at the river, I rolled up my trousers aimed the stick at the fish in the water, and soon I had caught several fish. Eve sat quietly on the shore, watching me, and occasionally gave me an encouraging look. "We have a good catch today." I returned to the shore with the fish. Eve handed me a brand new towel. I touched her head and said, "You are a girl. I can't use this towel." "Why?" She blinked, looking puzzled. Seeing her somewhat disappointed expression, I sighed. Okay, okay. Can I use it?" I picked up the towel and pretended to wipe my face. "Let's go grill the fish." I watched the disappointment on Eve's face finally fade away, and I gathered my energy to prepare for today's feast. I took out the charcoal, skewers, and lighter hidden in the back of the small room. Everything was clean and new, as if it was specially prepared for today. I built a simple stove with stones and lit the charcoal. The flames danced and reflected my face. Seeing these things running in an orderly manner, I suddenly felt a sense of satisfaction. Okay, let's start processing the fish. I took the fish I just caught to the river to clean it. The system popped up a prompt at the right time. "Fresh fish, dead less than half an hour ago. Best for making soup." I sneered. Who would listen to you? I just love grilling. After cleaning the fish, I picked up the skewers and skewered them, then walked to the fire and started grilling the fish. I called out to Eve, "Come over and learn how to grill fish." She trotted over and squatted beside me, her eyes full of anticipation. "Put the fish on the fire first, turn it over every 2 minutes, and remember to apply some oil." I demonstrated and explained, "Wait until it sizzles, then sprinkle cumin, pepper, salt, and finally chili powder, and the aroma will come out." Eve looked at me seriously, but finally shook her head. "Can't remember?" I smiled. "Forget it, it doesn't matter if you can't learn it. Just eat it." She nodded and smiled faintly. The aroma of grilled fish gradually spread, and the air was filled with the aroma of cumin and chili powder. My stomach began to growl. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound in the grass in the distance, and a skinny cat poked its head out. The kitten looked at the grilled fish in my hand timidly, meowing as if begging for me. I hesitated for a moment and looked at Eve. "Give it to it?" She nodded with pity in her eyes. I picked up a fish and put it in front of the cat. The kitten sniffed it, carefully picked up the fish, and ran back to the bushes. Eve looked at this scene, and a warm smile appeared on her lips, as if the sun was shining on her face. "You're smiling." I handed her a freshly grilled fish. "It's yours, try it." She took the fish carefully. Her movements were so gentle that I felt a little distressed. As I watched her slowly take a bite, her eyes lit up. "Is it delicious?" I asked with a smile. She nodded repeatedly, her face full of satisfaction, as if this simple grilled fish had become the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. After eating, I cleaned up the place, washed the things I used, and put them back to their original places. Looking at her, I became serious and said, "Don't come out without my permission, understand?" She nodded obediently. I turned and walked towards the river. Finally, I can take a bath. The river water was cool and clear, and I took a refreshing bath to wash away my fatigue. It was then that I realized that although life is hard, it is also a bit fun. After I finished, I called Eve out, but there was no movement in the room. I felt nervous, so I quickened my pace and pushed open the door, only to see her lying quietly on the bed, asleep, with a faint smile on her lips. She looked peaceful and beautiful in her deep sleep, with a blush on her cheeks and her hair scattered on the pillow, like a quiet and beautiful painting. I quietly closed the door, fearing that I would wake her up. I went outside and lay on my back on the mat, looking up at the starry sky. The stars on a summer night were particularly bright, like diamonds inlaid in the sky. I stared at them in a daze, and the recent events emerged in my mind. From the time I traveled through time to now, I have experienced too many absurdities and embarrassments, but at this moment, this starry sky makes me feel unprecedented peace. At least, now I have someone by my side, this feeling is really good. There are so many challenges in the future, but tonight, let me immerse myself under the starry sky. I closed my eyes. My heart was calm, but full of strength, looking forward to the rising sun tomorrow. The morning sun was shining brightly on the ground. I woke up from the cool mat and was startled by a soft touch as soon as I opened my eyes. The touch was strange and warm, which made me stunned for a moment and subconsciously looked in the direction of my hand. Eve was lying quietly on the other side of the mat, sleeping soundly, with a look of complete relaxation on her face. Her breathing was even and steady, like an innocent child. Why is she here? I stared at her small face, my mind full of questions. Shouldn't we let her sleep in the room? And the touch just now. Where exactly was it? I couldn't help myself, so I gently reached out and pinched her face. It was soft and elastic. So, this is what a girl's face feels like. I laughed at myself in my heart. After all, I never had the chance to know before. After getting up, I started to clean the room and put the messy things in the cabinet into a bucket. There was no electricity, and I had to cook with charcoal, so I had to wait quietly for her to wake up. After a while, Eve slowly got up. She rubbed her eyes. Her hair was messy, and her movements were as lazy as a kitten. She said softly, "Good morning. Why did you sleep next to me?" I asked her in a low voice. She lowered her head and answered shyly, "I was scared. I wanted to be with you." Hearing this, my heart was burning, but I could only smile awkwardly. "Go wash up. I'll take you to eat buns later." Her eyes lit up, and she nodded obediently, muttering softly, "Bull's delicious." Looking at her expectant look, I suddenly felt that life was not so hard. Walking into the bustling morning market, the streets were full of people, and the air was filled with the aroma of buns and soy milk. Eve pulled the corner of my clothes and pointed to a stall not far away. That one. Mao Xiaolao Di Baozi shop. I looked at the name of the shop and smiled, then took her over. "Boss, give me 4 buns." The boss was a middle-aged aunt, and her tone was very enthusiastic. "What kind of filling do you want?" "We have tofu, vermicelli, and pickle beans." I turned to ask Eve, and she whispered, "Tofu." The boss looked at Eve and was stunned for a moment, as if he recognized something. "Little girl, have we met before somewhere?" Eve shook her head, and the boss smiled and said, "If you're destined to meet me, I'll give you one." Hearing this, I felt nervous and quickly reached into my pocket, only to find that I didn't have much money left. "What's wrong? Didn't you bring enough?" The boss seemed to see through my embarrassment and secretly winked at me. "Give more next time, and don't let the girl know." I nodded and quickly took the buns. When paying, Eve suddenly took out a bank card and handed it to the boss. I stared at her with wide eyes. A little girl even brought a card? After swiping the card, she handed it to me and said, "Keep it for me." I touched her head and put the card back in her pocket. "You should take care of your own things, okay?" She looked up at me and said seriously, "You are not someone else." These words made me feel warm in my heart. After breakfast, we returned to the place where I used to make a living, but found another homeless man sitting there. He was wearing ragged clothes and was turning a coin in his hand, which immediately attracted my attention. "Hey, this is my territory, don't you know?" I stared at him coldly. He replied disdainfully, "Did you write your name on it? If not, how can it be yours? The thing with my name on it is mine, right?" I stepped forward, grabbed his hand, and snatched the coin away. He struggled and shouted, "That's mine. Don't take it." "Yours? Then look at what's written on it." I held the coin in front of him. He was stunned for a moment, staring at the 2 words on it, Eve. "So, what if you wrote your name? There are so many people named Eve. How can you prove it's yours?" The man was still shouting, his tone full of arrogance and disdain. I took a deep breath, knowing that it was useless to reason with such a person. So I replied coldly, "Don't believe it? The police station is nearby. Do you want to come with me?" The expression on the man's face froze. The man who had been so arrogant just now wilted like an eggplant hit by frost. "Actually, I know that the police station will not check fingerprints for a coin, but scaring people is still effective." I looked at his expression and sneered. "What? You don't want to talk anymore? Weren't you quite capable just now?" He stammered, "I." Then I put the coins in my pocket, patted him on the shoulder, and said, "The rest is for you. Stop stealing and get out of here." The man ran away in disgrace. I breathed a sigh of relief, took out the coin with the word Eve written on it, and wiped it. I thought to myself, I can throw away other things, but I can't throw this away. Eve stood by and clutched the corner of my clothes tightly, looking a little uneasy. I squatted down and asked her, "What's wrong?" "You were angry just now." Her voice was small, as if she was afraid of offending me. I smiled and said, "Of course, my things were stolen. Of course I am angry." "Important things?" She tilted her head and looked at me, her eyes full of confusion. I handed her the coin and said, "Yes, this is an important thing." She was stunned for a moment, then slowly reached out to take the coin and whispered, "This is mine." She gently stroked the coin, as if she saw the memories behind it. "Yes, so it is important." I nodded, then raised my head and met her clear eyes. She suddenly asked, "What about me? Am I important too?" I was speechless for a moment. My face turned red unconsciously. I scratched my head and whispered, Of course, it's important. After she heard it, her nervous expression instantly relaxed, and she nodded gently. Yeah. I turned around, slapped my face, and said to myself, what the hell am I doing? Talking to a girl I just met. I don't even know how long I can stay with her. You seem to sense my mood. She gently held my hand and said softly, I want to hold. I didn't say anything, but just let her hold it silently. We sat on the floor, cushioned by a piece of cardboard. I took out the buns I had just bought and handed them to her. I watched her little hands take the buns, take a bite, and a gleam of light flashed in her eyes. She ate very seriously, as if the only thing in the world was this bun in her hand. There was some flour on the corner of her mouth, and I couldn't help but smile. Eat slowly, no one will snatch it from you. She picked up another bun and handed it to me. You eat it. I shook my head. I'll eat it later. You eat it first. She nodded and started taking small bites again. After eating the buns, I walked back with her. When we passed a waste recycling station, a thought suddenly flashed through my mind. Yes, isn't the function of the system for this thing? Back at the bridge tunnel, I ran to the recycling station and looked around and found some waterproof cloth and a brand new socket. The system prompt immediately popped up. The waterproof cloth is clean and lightproof and can block wind and rain. The socket is worth 30 yuan. Hey, that's interesting. I can earn $30 just by doing this? I happily carried the things back to the bridge tunnel. Eve ran over and tried to take the things from my hand, but I waved my hand. No, just sit and wait. I simply built a frame and surrounded it with waterproof cloth, and the simple bathroom was ready. Seeing Eve coming over with her hands on her stomach, I quickly asked, what's wrong? Did you eat something bad? She shook her head and whispered, to the bathroom. I slapped my forehead and quickly took her to a nearby public toilet, thinking to myself, it seems that I really need to solve this problem in the future. I returned to the bridge in the afternoon, put the bowl in front of me, and started begging. I didn't expect that quite a few people would pass by, and the system notification sounded one after another. Points plus 500. Just when I was happy, a man in a suit came over, smiled coldly, and said, it's a narrow road for enemies to meet, kid. I looked up and saw that it was the guy who had snatched territory during the day. What are you doing here again? I was too lazy to pay attention to him. He mocked, I'm here to give you alms so that you can't hold your head up high. I rolled my eyes. Are you stupid? The more you give, the happier I am. He stamped his feet in anger and finally said, forget it, I have something else to do. He turned and ran away. I looked at his back and thought to myself, this guy is really a weirdo. When the two policemen stood in front of me, I was panicked. It's over. I haven't committed any crime recently. Why are they here? Although I said calmly, my palms were sweating. The policeman sat down, showed his ID, and said, we have received a report that you are suspected of endangering the life and safety of others. My mind buzzed. What kind of serious crime is this? I turned around and saw that it was indeed the old man who had robbed me that morning standing behind the policeman, mumbling something. I slapped my forehead and immediately understood the whole story. Uncle Police, it's a misunderstanding. I hurriedly explained, telling him everything about Eve and how the old man had robbed me of my money in the morning and asked Eve to help testify. Is that true? The policeman asked doubtfully. I quickly motioned for Eve to answer. She nodded, still hiding behind me, with fear in her eyes, but no sign of lying. Finally, the police took the old woman away, saying she was suspected of defamation. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that this farce was finally over, but I couldn't help but curse. I can run into such people everywhere. How unlucky. I continued walking with Eve, thinking about what to do next. Mobile phone. Yes, buy a secondhand mobile phone to solve the problem of communication first. So, I walked into a secondhand mobile phone store. Boss, do you have any secondhand mobile phones under 200 yuan? As soon as I asked, the boss looked up with disbelief on his face. Under 200 yuan? Brother, in this day and age, you're buying a keypad phone. Do you have it? I insisted. He took out a cell phone from under the cabinet and said, this one is worth 50 yuan. I'll give you 200 yuan, a fair price. I scanned it with the system, and it showed that the phone was worth 50 yuan at most. I looked at the boss and said calmly, 100. If you want to sell it, then sell it. If you don't want to sell it, forget it. The boss was so angry that he blew his beard and glared at me. You are so unreasonable. All right, I'll give you 100. Take it and get out of here. Just as I was about to pay, Eve pulled at the corner of my clothes. She lowered her head and said softly, I hate people who say bad things about you. I was stunned for a moment. This was the first time she said so much. I touched her head and said with a smile, It's okay, I don't care. But she whispered back, I care. This sentence made my heart tremble, and I suddenly felt a little touched. Seeing that the atmosphere was not right, the boss quickly waved his hand and said, okay, I'll sell it to you for 80 yuan and give you a charger as a gift. Now go. I took the phone with a smile, turned around, and left. After leaving the house, Eve and I went to apply for 2 phone cards, thinking that with a mobile phone, life would at least be more convenient. Next, we went to the waste recycling station to check the situation. When I got to the door of the recycling station, I saw a phone number that said for rent. I quickly dialed the number, and a crying voice came from the other end. Who is it? After I reported the situation, the other party suddenly became excited. Where are you? I'll be there right away. Not long after, a taxi stopped by the roadside, and a man in a suit got out. He walked with a breeze and looked like a business elite. I was stunned, and I felt that he looked familiar. No way. I whispered. Sure enough, he also saw me and was stunned for a moment. It's you? Yes, the man in the suit was Wang Gang, who had competed with me for territory in the morning. Hey, what a coincidence. I scratched my head awkwardly. He frowned and asked, Where is my client? I spread my hands and said, Yes, I am your client. The air froze instantly. He looked me up and down, his tone full of shock. What's wrong with you? You robbed me of 500 yuan during the day, and you want to use my recycling station for free at night? Free? No, I'll pay you. I answered seriously. He sneered and asked, Did you win the lottery? Or are you being kept by a rich woman? None of them. I shrugged, but I'm thick-skinned and dare to talk. He held his forehead, looking like he was about to die of anger. When Wang Gang heard my plan, his expression was amazing. You want to repair these scraps and then sell them? He widened his eyes and looked completely incredulous. I patted my chest and assured, That's right. As long as you use your brain, you can find value in waste. Wang Gang stared at me for a long time and finally nodded. Okay, I'll trust you this time, but this will be the last time. He sighed and muttered in a low voice. I've been unlucky enough today. Getting stood up is nothing. When I heard the phrase, being stood up, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Ha ha, so you didn't succeed in your confession, but were stood up? Wang Gang glared at me angrily. Don't laugh. It's all because of what you said about military advisors before, which made me full of confidence, but I got slapped in the face. I waved my hands. Okay, I was wrong. After signing the contract, Wang Gang handed me the key, said good luck, and left. But my heart was filled with joy. Finally, I don't have to sleep under a broken bridge. But when I returned to the bridge tunnel, I found something was wrong. Eve was curled up in the small room, her face full of panic, and there was obscene laughter outside. Hey, look, there's a school uniform here. Maybe it's a girl. 2 men's voices came from outside. I was instantly alert. Something's wrong. Someone is coming. Eve in her room when she heard the noise, but the 2 drunken men found our place and started banging on the door. Come out. Why are you hiding? A man shouted with a grin, kicked the door open, and grabbed Eve. When I arrived, I saw her being dragged out of the small room. Her face was full of fear, and her body looked helpless and weak because of her struggle. I was instantly furious. Damn it! I roared and rushed forward, punching the man in the face, knocking him out. Before the other man could react, I kicked him into the river. You are worthy of touching her? My voice echoed in the bridge hole, and I stared coldly at the 2 men struggling in the water. Every time they tried to climb ashore, I kicked them back into the river. Eve stood aside, with a hint of fear in her eyes, but more of trust in me. I walked over and pulled her behind me to protect her. I'm sorry I'm late. I patted her shoulder gently, my tone full of guilt. Eve shook her head slightly, but she didn't say anything. I then called the police and briefly reported the incident. Soon after, the police arrived, took the 2 drunks away, and took our statements. Before leaving, the police reminded me, It's okay, this is self-defense, but you still have to pay attention to safety. The girl seems to rely on you a lot. Take good care of her. After the police left, I felt a mixture of guilt, self-blame, and relief. I sat on the ground, propping my head up with my hands, wondering if I could have done better. At this time, Eve came to my side gently. She sat down, leaned her head on my shoulder, and said softly, Thank you. I was stunned for a moment, and just as I was about to speak, I felt her kiss my cheek gently. Although it was only a brief moment, the warmth made me completely forget the gloom just now. Eve's trust made me more determined. No matter how difficult the future is, I will not let her get hurt again. Holding her hand, I swore silently in my heart. That night, Eve and I sat outside the bridge, looking at the starry sky. The night sky was as beautiful as a painting. The stars in the sky were twinkling and seemed very close to us, but out of reach. Eve leaned gently on my shoulder, her body trembling slightly, as if she was telling me something. I reached out and hugged her gently, wanting her to feel at ease. Eve, I said, looking at the bright starry sky, I have good news to tell you. She looked at me puzzledly, as if waiting for an answer. Tomorrow, we can move into a real house. I said with a smile, we no longer have to endure the wind and sun here. There is a roof and 4 walls to protect us from the wind and rain. Eve's eyes lit up, and there was a hint of expectation in her voice. Then will we always be together? Her tone was uneasy, yet a little cautious. Looking at her clear eyes, I nodded. Yes, I will. I don't know why I was so sure, but I had to say it. Eve's smile was like sunshine, and her happiness was directly contagious to my heart. My heartbeat accelerated, but I could only ask myself silently, am I in love? She had fallen asleep, and her gentle breathing was particularly clear in the night breeze. I looked at her slightly red lips, and my mind was in a mess. What would it feel like? I slowly approached until I was less than a centimeter away, and suddenly a sense of shame hit me. I raised my head abruptly and slapped my face. What am I doing? How can I be a man if I take advantage of someone's misfortune? I picked up Eve, gently put her on the bed, and covered her with a blanket. She murmured in her sleep, Don't go. I felt sad and gently touched her head. I won't leave, good night. The next morning, the sun shone through the cracks in the bridge hole, and I got up early. Today is a special day, and I want to give Eve a little surprise. I walked into the Xiao Mao Loudy Bowsy shop and ordered 4 tofu buns, Eve's favorite. The boss joked, Young man, are you buying these for your girlfriend? I just smiled and didn't answer. When we got back to the bridge tunnel, Eve was still asleep. I sat beside her and put the thermal bag aside. When she woke up, she saw the buns in my hand and smiled brightly. Good morning. I brought you your favorite tofu bun. She took a bite, and the happiness in her eyes warmed my heart. At that moment, I felt that everything I did was worth it. After breakfast, I started to pack my luggage. Although there were not many things in the bridge hole, each item had our memories. I packed them carefully. When everything was ready, I took Eve's hand and said, Let's go to our new home. Eve nodded with a happy smile on her face. I knew she was full of expectations for our future. We arrived at the door of our new home, and I opened the door with my key. When the door opened, Eve and I were stunned by the scene inside. A spacious and bright living room, a comfortable sofa, a modern kitchen, and even 2 bedrooms and a clean and tidy bathroom. How does this look like a house that can be found in a recycling station? I stood at the door for a long time and couldn't help but take out my cell phone and called Wang Gang. Hey, your second floor house is so luxurious. Is it really for the people at the scrap recycling station to live in? On the other end of the phone, Wang Gang laughed. Why? Are you not satisfied? Anyway, you have to work hard for me once you move in. I listened to the laughter on the phone, but my heart was filled with gratitude. Eve standing in the living room with an unconcealable excitement on her face. I secretly vowed in my heart, I must manage this family well and make her feel safe forever. The morning sun shone through the curtains into the room. I woke up from my sleep and found that something seemed to be pressing down on me. I opened my eyes and found Eve lying quietly beside me. Her face was white and delicate, and she was sleeping soundly. Her breath brushed my neck gently, making me feel a little uncomfortable. One of her hands was on my chest, and the soft touch made me freeze instantly. Oh my God! How did she get here? I was so panicked that I dared not move for fear of waking her up. My eyes involuntarily fell on her face. Her lips were slightly raised, as if she was dreaming of something happy. The tip of her nose was slightly upturned, and her long eyelashes were like butterfly wings, trembling gently. No, no! I suddenly realized that I had been looking at her for too long and quickly looked away. However, this close and tender scene made me not know what to do. I tried to gently move her arm away with my hand, but unexpectedly, she suddenly muttered in her sleep, Don't go. The voice was as soft as a mosquito, but it was like a hammer hitting my heart. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself down. After putting her in the room and covering her with a blanket, I quietly walked out of the room, lay on the sofa, and patted my hot face. It's over. I'm completely screwed now. I laughed at myself. When facing Eve, I always feel a sense of responsibility and warmth that I can't refuse. The next morning, I went to the steamed bun shop on the corner and bought her favorite tofu buns. When I got home, she was still sleeping. I quietly sat by her bed, waiting for her to wake up. Eve, good morning. I handed her the tofu bun and saw the satisfied smile on her face. I felt even happier than eating the bun. I'm going to take you to a place today. After breakfast, I took her hand and left the bridge tunnel where we had lived for a long time. Along the way, I felt particularly relaxed. Although the new home was simple, it had a roof and 4 walls, which was much better than a bridge hole. Thinking about the life ahead, I was full of expectations for the future. When I arrived at my new home, I opened the door and saw the brand new living room, sofa, and bedroom. I was stunned. This place was even better than I had imagined. Clean, tidy, fully furnished, and even had curtains. This was completely different from the conditions at the recycling station. Is this the scrap recycling station left by Wang Gang's grandfather? Or the mansion he hid? I was stunned for a moment, but still called Wang Gang. Hey, are you sure this place is for people from the scrap recycling station to live in? His voice came from the other end of the phone. Of course, not satisfied? Then return it to me. It's not that I'm dissatisfied, it's just, isn't your grandfather a little too avant-garde? I teased and couldn't help laughing. After I hung up the phone, I saw Eve sitting on the sofa, hugging a pillow, and her expression was much more relaxed. Perhaps this was the first time she felt the warmth of a real home. Looking at all this, I secretly made up my mind. Eve, don't worry, I will work hard to make our lives better and better. David touched his empty pockets, a helpless expression on his face. He sighed and said to himself, this is too miserable. I don't even have money to buy groceries. I really have to find a way to make some money. He looked at the nearby streets, wondering if he should try his luck at the scrap recycling station. But then he thought, although there were a lot of things there, it was not easy to exchange those scraps for cash that could be used immediately. Just as he was hesitating, a child came running over with a bunch of used plastic bottles in his hands. The child ran and shouted, Uncle, give me some money. Waste can also be exchanged for money. David suddenly had a brilliant idea. He quickly ran to a nearby supermarket and stood at the door and shouted to passersby, recycle used plastic bottles, 30 cents each. It's higher than the market price. Passersby were attracted by David's enthusiasm, and several of them immediately took out the plastic bottles in their hands and handed them over. Oh, your bottle is so clean. Here you go. David took the bottle and handed over a few dimes. After all this, he had accumulated several plastic bottles in his hand and finally had a few coins in his pocket. He took the bottles to a recycling station and sold them at a slightly higher price. He actually made a small profit from the difference. It's not much, but at least it's a start. David held the few coins tightly together, hope in his eyes. His mind began to work again. If I can expand this business a little bit, maybe I can even cover my living expenses. He bought some simple vegetables and meat and returned home. As soon as he opened the door, Eve was sitting in the living room waiting for him. Seeing David sweating profusely, she immediately ran over to help him get the things. I bought a lot of food. Eve's voice was filled with a hint of surprise, but also mixed with confusion. Didn't you say you had no money? David touched his nose and smiled. Hey, I earned it with my intelligence. Otherwise, how could I support you? Eve looked at David with an indescribable warmth in her eyes. She whispered, Thank you. What are you thanking me for? We are a family. David patted her shoulder. Although he said it lightly, his heart was very warm. He took Eve to the kitchen to put the dishes together, rolled up his sleeves, and prepared to cook. Although his cooking skills were not superb, in order to make Eve eat better, David planned to show his skills and make her a tomato-stewed egg. The kitchen was filled with a rich aroma. Eve stood nearby and couldn't help but smile as she watched David busying around. Just wait. I'm going to make sure you have the best meal today. David turned around and grinned at Eve, his tone full of confidence. The food was served. Although it looked ordinary, it tasted surprisingly good. Eve ate with gusto, chewing mouthful after mouthful, with a smile on her face that became sweeter and sweeter. Is it delicious? David looked at her expectantly. Yeah. Eve nodded heavily, with some ketchup on the corner of her mouth, looking cute and satisfied. David looked at her and felt satisfied. Maybe he hadn't achieved anything great yet, but at least he could make the girl in front of him feel more at ease and happy. After dinner, the two sat on the sofa, and David suddenly remembered the new lock. He pointed at the door and said, I changed the lock today, and you will be safer in the future. Here is the key. Remember to carry it with you. Eve took the key and nodded solemnly. Seeing her serious look, David suddenly felt that maybe he was not so useless. Although he became a beggar after traveling through time, at least now he had something to protect. Eve, we're going to start a new life. David smiled slightly, his eyes showing determination. Trust me, I will definitely make your life better. David originally thought that he would spend his entire life languishing in the shadow of a bridge tunnel, barely surviving on the small change given by others. But all these changes began on that rainy night. A girl covered in scars broke into his life and brought a glimmer of light to his world. That day, I was still huddled under the bridge, thinking about how to make a living the next day. Suddenly, I heard the sound of rushing water. I looked up and saw a petite figure jumping into the icy river. I almost subconsciously rushed out and jumped into the biting cold current. That was Eve, a girl who seemed fragile but stubborn. From the moment I rescued her from the water, I knew that my fate was no longer a story of one person. When she woke up, her face was pale and her eyes were empty. She just stared at me blankly. I asked her where her home was, but she just lowered her head and murmured, "I have no home." The three words "no home" pierced my heart like an awl. How long can a girl without a home live in this cold world? I didn't think much about it and took her back to my bridge tunnel. Although it was shabby and simple, it could at least shelter her from the wind and rain. In order to stop her from being afraid, I even used my little savings to buy her clothes and cooked simple meals for her. Slowly, Eve began to show her trust in me. She would grab the corner of my clothes when I wasn't paying attention or whisper thank you. That gentle look made me feel a sense of responsibility that I had never felt before. Gradually, I was no longer satisfied with the days under the bridge. I wanted to give Eve a real home, a safe and warm place. Later, I took over a recycling station. Although it was difficult, I was determined to start from here and stand up again. But life is not always peaceful. That night in the bridge tunnel, a group of homeless people wanted to hurt Eve. When I rushed back, I saw her curled up in a corner with tears all over her face. I was so angry that I beat those people severely. All this made me realize that brute force alone could not protect her. So I worked harder and turned the bridge hole into a house to give her a safe life. I also cooked a sumptuous dinner and tried my best to create a home feeling for her. Watching Eve eating her meal contentedly, I felt a surge of happiness I had never felt before. I knew that from that day on, I was no longer living just for myself. Along the way, I went from being a beggar to being her support, and Eve became my motivation to live. Life may be like this. When fate makes you lose everything, it will also give you hope in another way. Eve is my hope. It's okay. We are brothers. I'll be relieved if you can get better. While comforting Wang Gang, I was thinking about Eve in my mind, and I couldn't help feeling complicated. On the other end of the phone, Wang Gang seemed to suddenly remember something and asked excitedly, "By the way, you called me so many times today. What's the urgent matter? You don't want me to help you again, do you?" "Oh, that's true." I couldn't help but laugh, but it's been solved. I just changed the lock. Change the locks? You are really careful. Are you afraid that someone will steal from your house? Vong Gong Tist. Of course, it's not just about theft. The more important thing is safety. You know, my tone became a little more serious. There was silence on the other end of the phone for a while, and Wang Gang suddenly said, "It seems that you still care about that girl." "What? Are you serious about it?" Ah. I was a little speechless after his question and quickly denied it. "It's not what you think. I just I just think that it's not easy for her as a little girl, and I should take care of her." Wang Gang snorted softly and said with a smile, "Don't lie to yourself, buddy. If you didn't have any feelings, would you be so busy for her?" After hearing what he said, my heart skipped a beat, but I pretended to be relaxed and said, "Stop talking nonsense and think about your dating strategy." After hanging up the phone, I walked back to the living room and saw Eve still sleeping quietly on the sofa, her little face buried in the blanket, breathing steadily. Looking at her peaceful appearance, my heart softened. Maybe Wang Gang is right, I whispered to myself, and what he just said appeared in my mind again and again. But the next second, I immediately shook my head, trying to get rid of those unnecessary emotions. Forget it, let's not think too much about it for now, and just live one day at a time. I sighed, then picked up my phone and started searching for nearby supermarkets and grocery stores online. Life has just begun, and I know I have to work hard and not let Eve suffer with me. As night fell, the lights in the kitchen were warm, and I was busy at the stove. The pot was bubbling with steam, and the fragrance filled the whole room. Eve stood at the kitchen door, her eyes a little curious and a little cautious. Do you need my help? I turned around and smiled. No, just go and sit down. I'll call you when the meal is ready. Eve nodded obediently after hearing this, turned back to the living room, and sat down quietly. Seeing her obedient appearance, I felt a kind of satisfaction that I had never felt before. Maybe it is really a great feeling to have someone relying on you. During dinner, Eve ate very happily and showed a rare smile on her face. I couldn't help but ask with a smile, "Is it delicious?" She nodded, then picked up a piece of meat and put it in my bowl. "You eat too." Her voice was soft, but full of concern. "Thank you." I took the meat she handed me, and my heart felt soft. At that moment, I suddenly realized that perhaps her appearance has quietly changed my life. Chapter 17 System. It's up to you. After the tense and heavy atmosphere ended, Wang Gang asked curiously, "By the way, what did you call about before?" David was slightly stunned, then replied, "Well, I want you to introduce this recycling station to me." His tone was calm, as if he was just talking about an ordinary thing. Wang Gang immediately understood David's intention. He nodded and said, "Really? It's a small matter. I'll go over right away." 20 minutes later, Wang Gang arrived at David's apartment on time. He knocked on the door and walked in. David had been waiting at the door for a long time. The two greeted each other and then walked out of the apartment together. "That's pretty fast," David praised. Wang Gang smiled and replied, "Fortunately, there was a traffic jam on the road. Otherwise, we could go faster." There was a relaxed smile on his face, as if he had forgotten the previous tense atmosphere. "Okay, let's go there and take a look," said David. "Well, let's go." Wang Gang nodded, and the two of them walked towards the waste recycling station together. However, as they were about to leave the apartment, David suddenly remembered something. He turned around and said to Wang Gang, "That's right." Wang Gang was startled and asked quickly, "Huh? What's wrong?" There was a hint of worry in his eyes, fearing that David would ask some difficult questions again. David smiled and replied, "I forgot to tell you that I changed the lock on the second floor of your house." His tone was calm, as if he was just talking about a trivial matter. Wang Gang didn't show much surprise after hearing this. He nodded and said, "It's okay if I change it. It's not a big deal. Just give me the key before you leave." He still had a relaxed smile on his face, as if he was used to David's behavior. David was a little surprised when he heard this. He originally thought Wang Gang would be angry or dissatisfied, but he didn't expect him to accept this fact so calmly. He said with some emotion, "Ah, I thought you would be angry." Wang Gang shook his head and replied, "Why are you angry? We are all adults and I know this. But I have a question. You are a grown man living here alone. What are you afraid of?" There was a hint of teasing in his tone, as if he was testing David's bottom line. David listened, but did not answer his question directly. He was silent for a while and then said, "I don't know about that." There was a hint of mystery in his tone, which made people want to explore his inner world. The two soon arrived at the waste recycling station. Standing outside the station, David couldn't help but sigh at the scale of the place, with waste piled up like a mountain, as if it were a huge garbage kingdom. Wang Gang led David through a narrow passage and came to a greenhouse. He pressed a button on the remote control, and the automatic rolling door of the greenhouse slowly opened, revealing the scene inside. As soon as he entered the greenhouse, David was shocked by the scene in front of him. There were all kinds of discarded furniture inside, some of which were already dilapidated. Some of them still retained their original appearance. In addition to furniture, there are also a large number of electrical appliances, such as refrigerators, washing machines, televisions, etc., which lie there quietly, as if waiting to be reused. In addition, various tools are placed in the greenhouse, ranging from simple hammers and screwdrivers to mechanical equipment. These tools are scattered in every corner, and some even emit a faint smell of rust, making people feel the busyness that once existed here. This is where my grandfather used to work. There is also a place to store spare parts next to it. David looked at the scene in front of him and said in amazement, "Your grandfather is really amazing. He uses so many things by himself. Well, he just likes these weird things. He says that repairing them and selling them is a very proud thing." At this time, David asked doubtfully, "Can it really be sold?" "Of course. People here like to buy some bargains. Why buy new ones when the repaired ones can be used for several years?" "That's true, but your grandfather still replaced all the houses for that little apartment." "Yes, although all the items are replenished." "Okay, what else do you want to know?" Wang Gang asked. Nothing more, let's go. After leaving the recycling station, David and Wang Gang returned to their apartment. After sitting down in the room, David suddenly asked Wang Gang about his high school. Which school did you go to in high school? David asked. Shinkong City Number 1 Middle School, abbreviated as Shingy Middle School. Wang Gang replied. David heard this. Eve suddenly appeared in his mind. He remembered that Eve also studied in this school, so he asked, Really? Are there many people who bully their classmates in your school? Wang Gang was puzzled after hearing David's question. He shook his head and replied, I don't know about that. After all, I haven't encountered it before. There was a hint of confusion in his eyes, as if he didn't understand why David asked this question. David couldn't help feeling a little embarrassed after hearing Wang Gang's answer. He knew that his question might confuse Wang Gang, but he didn't know how to explain it. He could only smile, trying to hide his embarrassment and uneasiness. It's okay, I'm just asking, David said. Wang Gang looked at David's awkward smile and couldn't help feeling a little confused. He frowned and asked, Why are you asking this? There was a hint of vigilance and curiosity in his tone. David was a little flustered after hearing Wang Gang's question. He hesitated for a moment, then replied, It's okay, I'm just asking. There was a hint of hesitation and uneasiness in his tone, as if he was unwilling to reveal too much of his thoughts. Forget it. Since we've already finished talking about the recycling station, I'll go back. As for how you open this place, that's your business. Don't worry about this. Then I'll leave first. It's getting late. Then Wang Gang left the apartment. As for how to open it, of course it depends on the system. After all, this system only has this function. David said to himself. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Eve slowly sat up from the sofa. She rubbed her eyes, as if looking for something. David, her voice was so soft that it was almost inaudible. But in this quiet afternoon, this faint call was like an electric current that instantly spread throughout the room. At this time, David just brought out a plate of cut fruit from the kitchen. He came to Eve and put the fruit on the coffee table. You're awake. I bought this afternoon. I don't know if you like it. I like everything you bought, Eve whispered. Then he started eating it in small bites. Chapter 18, I should have expected this. As the evening came, David heated up the remaining food and brought it to the table. Eat it. Even though it's for lunch, it might not taste good, David said apologetically. Eve looked at David's busy figure and felt a warm feeling in her heart. She shook her head and whispered, It's okay, I'll like it if you do it. David felt warm in his heart after hearing this. He looked at Eve with a smile and said, Really? Then I will make more delicious food for you in the future. After dinner, the two sat on the sofa and watched TV. There were some relaxing programs on TV, but David's mind was not on the programs. By the way, are you studying at Shinkong City Number 1 Middle School? David suddenly asked. Eve nodded, but there was a hint of timidity in her eyes. She clenched her hands tightly, as if trying to suppress the fear in her heart. David couldn't help feeling distressed when he saw Eve's appearance. Can you take me to see it tomorrow? David asked with concern. He wanted to see with his own eyes the place that terrified Eve, and he also wanted to learn more about her. Eve turned pale when she heard what David said. She shook her head and said in a trembling voice, No. Her eyes were full of fear, as if there was a demon in the school that would eat David up. David looked at Eve's horrified expression. He knew that Eve was afraid that he would get hurt, so she refused so firmly. Eve hair gently and said softly, Really? Then don't go. His tone was full of firmness and trust, which made Eve feel at ease. After a long time, Eve's emotions gradually stabilized. She leaned quietly on David's shoulder, a hint of fatigue in her eyes. A relaxing program was playing on the TV screen, but her thoughts drifted to a distant place. David hugged Eve gently, feeling the warmth of her body and the rhythm of her breathing. He knew that what Eve needed at this moment was quietness and warmth. He gently adjusted his position so Eve was more comfortable against his shoulder. Gradually, Eve's south eyes began to close, and her breathing became slow and deep. Her body relaxed in David's arms, as if all her worries and fears were dissipating into the air with her breath. David looked at Eve sleeping peacefully, and a tender emotion welled up in his heart. Eve's hair gently, feeling the feel of her soft hair sliding across his fingertips. His eyes never left Eve's face, as if he wanted to freeze her beauty and gentleness in his heart forever. It's great. I don't know since when this little girl started to rely on me. Before I traveled through time, I was just an office worker who commuted between 2 points, but now it seems like I have become a girl's brother. David whispered to himself, with a hint of emotion and relief in his voice. He sat on the sofa, looking at Eve's lovely face and lost in thought. The future is full of unknowns and variables, while the past has become a memory. He couldn't predict the future, nor could he go back to the past. But he knew that he had to cherish the present and every moment with Eve. Let's go back to the room. David gently placed Eve on the bed, tucked her in, and tiptoed out of the room. Eve, who was sleeping soundly. I think she will still hold her hand, David thought to himself. But this time, Eve did not hold his hand, probably because she was sleeping too deeply. That's good. David felt a little disappointed, but this was also a proof of his growth. Afterwards, David returned to his room. He looked at the ceiling quietly, thinking about something in his mind, but not long after, he could not hold on any longer and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, David's door was gently opened and a slender figure walked in. Eve held a pillow in her hand. She carefully placed it next to David's bed and then lay down gently beside him. Early in the morning, David woke up from bed and saw Eve lying next to him in an ambiguous posture. Eve in disbelief. Her cheeks were slightly flushed and her eyes were closed, as if she was sleeping. He gently moved away, trying to keep some distance from Eve. However, Eve seemed to notice his movements, and she gently turned over and leaned on David's shoulder. David's heartbeat quickened again, and he felt Eve's breath brushing his cheek, bringing a faint fragrance. He didn't know how to deal with this situation, and he felt that his heart was full of contradictions and struggles. David took a deep breath and tried to keep himself calm. After a long time, he patted his face. After all this time, I should have known this would happen. Eve shouldered gently and said softly, Eve, get up. Eve slowly opened her eyes and looked at David's face, seeming a little confused. She sat up gently, looked at David and said, Good morning. Good morning. After getting up, everyone washed up and David went out. When he came back, he was holding a few buns, paper, pen, and some drawing pens in his hand. Eve, breakfast today. But Eve looked at him in confusion. Then she pointed at the refrigerator and whispered, Inside, there is. At this time, David shook his head and said, You can't eat such greasy food in the morning. Although Eve didn't quite understand, she still nodded and said, Got it. David was sitting at the table. After breakfast, he picked up a paintbrush and tried to conceive an eye-catching promotional advertisement. But he thought for a long time, and his mind was still empty. Finally, he sighed and decided to give up. At this time, Eve came over, looked at the white paper in front of David, and asked, Can I help? David looked at Eve and suddenly realized something, then handed Eve a pen and paper. Oh. David scratched his head sheepishly, then said, Can you help me draw an advertisement for the recycling station? That way, when others see it, they'll know that there are useful old things for sale here. Eve picked up the paintbrush as if she was holding the key to another world. She moved gently across the paper, each stroke filled with power and emotion. The picture gradually took shape in her hands, as if the world deep in her heart was being revealed bit by bit. The air around them seemed to become heavy, as if even the air was filled with Eve's emotions. Her eyes were focused and deep, as if she could see through the surface of the paper and directly touch the hidden world. As time went by, the picture became more and more complete. Finally, when the last stroke was made, Eve breathed a sigh of relief and put down her brush. All right. David took the painting, looked at it carefully, and couldn't help but sigh that it was a very good painting. Chapter 19, Venting. Really, Eve's eyes revealed a hint of happiness, as if this was the first time someone praised his painting. David looked at Eve quietly. He could feel her uneasiness and confusion. He took a deep breath and tried to make his voice sound calm and firm. Really, Eve, he said softly, and then handed the painting to Eve. This is the result of your creation. Let's go and put it where it belongs. Eve took the painting and her fingers gently touched the texture of the paper, as if she was feeling the meaning behind it. She raised her head and looked at David, with a hint of hesitation and expectation in her eyes. Okay, she said softly, revealing an indescribable firmness in her voice. They left the room and came to the downtown area. The streets were bustling with people, and all kinds of sounds intertwined to form a unique hustle and bustle. David and Eve moved among the crowd, their eyes searching for that familiar place. After some searching, they finally found a place specifically for posting advertisements. There were already some people gathered there, busy putting up various advertisements and promotional posters. David and Eve walked to a vacant corner and began preparing to post their drawings. They carefully unrolled the scroll and spread it flat on the wall. Eve's hand gently stroked the drawing paper, as if bidding it farewell. Chung Zae stood aside, silently observing Eve's actions, his heart filled with warmth and emotion. When the painting was perfectly attached to the wall, David and Eve both breathed a sigh of relief. They stepped back to admire their work, which shone brightly in the sunlight. That's all. However, just as they were immersed in joy, Eve suddenly seemed to see something. Her eyes instantly became frightened and nervous, and her body began to tremble uncontrollably. She immediately hid beside David and held his arm tightly, as if trying to draw some sense of security from him. David immediately noticed that something was wrong with Eve. He followed Eve's gaze and saw three strange women staring at her. David seemed to understand something at this moment, and then comforted her. "Don't be afraid. I'm here." David's words were like a warm current, instantly dispelling the haze in Eve's heart. At this time, three women came over. Facing the three arrogant and domineering women, his eyes revealed a hint of disdain and ridicule. "Hey, isn't this our big shot, Eve? Why? Do you want to experience being bullied today?" A woman taunted, with a smug smile on her lips. David smiled slightly, with a hint of provocation in his eyes. "You three clowns, are you worthy enough to talk to me? I'm in a good mood today, and I don't want to argue with you." "Who are you? Why are you speaking for her?" a woman said. "Who am I? You don't deserve to know." David angrily. "What did you say? Who do you think you are? How dare you be so arrogant?" David shrugged, his tone relaxed and mocking. "I am the height that you will never reach. You clowns can only fight on the streets, but you will never achieve anything." The three women were so angry at David's words that they jumped up and down. They looked at each other and then rushed towards David together. David easily dodged their attacks and punched one of the bullies to the ground. "You are courting death," David sneered, his eyes revealing a kind of coldness and cruelty. "Since you have come to my door, don't blame me for being rude." Then David slapped the three people to the ground, and then David continued to taunt. "Come on, don't you like dogs barking? Why don't you bark?" The three women covered their faces and shouted, "Just wait. I'm going to call the police now. I'll make sure you eat the government's food for the rest of your life." David just sneered. He seemed to have known the result. Then he continued, "Go ahead and fight. It's useless even if you fight." David stood there with a sneer on his face, as if everything was under his control. Then a siren sounded and two policemen appeared at the scene. "Who called the police?" said a policeman. Then the three women immediately rushed to the police and told them about their sufferings. "It was him. He was the one who hit me." The police walked up to David and asked seriously, "What's wrong with you? Why did you hit someone?" David calmly explained what happened. He told the police that it was the three women who provoked and insulted Eve first, and he intervened to stop them. David's explanation. The police began to investigate the truth of the matter. They questioned witnesses around, collected evidence, and took statements from David and the three women. After investigation, the police found that David's statement was true, and he was indeed acting in self-defense. The three women received the punishment they deserved for their impulsiveness and unreasonable behavior. In the end, the police imposed administrative penalties on the three women and warned them not to make similar mistakes in the future. After the police left, the three women spoke provocatively to David and Eve. "Wait until we get to school and see how you protect her." Then the man left here angrily, and they kept covering their faces when they left. Yeah, in fact, David had another plan in mind, but it was not needed for the time being. Eve looked up at David, tears in her eyes. She nodded slightly and said with a choked voice, "Thank you." David hugged Eve gently and whispered to her, "Don't cry, don't be afraid. I told you I won't let you get hurt." Eve leaned in David's arms and let her tears fall. Her heart was filled with gratitude and trust, knowing that David would always be by her side. As the matter was over, the people around them gradually dispersed, leaving only the two of them standing in front of the advertising column. Then David suggested, "Let's go to the supermarket and buy some of your favorite food." His tone was full of care and consideration. However, at this moment, he inadvertently glanced at his mobile phone and found that his e-wallet was empty. Eve seemed to be aware of David's situation. She whispered, "At home, and we don't need to buy too much." She tried to ease David's predicament. David felt a little apologetic. He whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't expect my money would go away so quickly." And Eve responded gently, "It doesn't matter. As long as you are by my side, that's enough." Chapter 20. Change of Mindset. After a month of operation, David's recycling station was finally opened. David placed some usable and useful things on the first floor of their house. After that incident, Eve's mood and mentality gradually improved, and she was willing to talk to others. Although she was still a little restrained, she had made a lot of progress compared to before. Eve, are you tired? David asked with concern. Eve smiled and replied, Not tired. You can go back and have some rest. There are no more guests. Really? Don't you need me to accompany you? Well, I won't use it for now. Okay, I'll go up then. David looked at Eve in front of him. She was no longer as taciturn as when they first met, but her personality changed a little too quickly, leaving David at a loss as to what to do for a moment. David and Eve were currently on the first floor of their house, receiving guests who came to buy secondhand items. Most of the customers are elderly people. They came here because they heard that there were cheap and useful things. David, a familiar voice sounded at the door. Vongum, why are you here? I see the summer vacation is almost over. Don't you have to do your homework? Homework? What's that? We don't have homework on holiday. Ah. This sentence gave David a new understanding of the world. Then Chu said in surprise, Is this true? Otherwise, as your landlord, would I cheat you? Wang Gang said with a filthy look on his face. Well, I thought you had summer homework. Oh, the so-called vacation is for people to have a good rest. If you assign homework during the summer vacation, what's the difference between that and going to school? That's true. Then Wang Gang glanced at David's side with a puzzled look. Where's your little girlfriend? What girlfriend? Then my sister. David retorted with a red face. Wang Gang waved his hand. TSK, don't think I don't know. A month ago, you called the police to vent your anger on her. Did you see it? Of course. After all, there are so many people around, everyone has to join in the fun. All right, but you know what? It makes my blood boil. This is the kind of people I can't stand the most. They are ugly themselves, but they look down on others. Wang Gang's tone was obviously a little angry. Indeed, but luckily it was self-defense. Otherwise, I might have to go to jail. Well, but I think you are very courageous. If it were me, I might not be able to do the same as you. Wang Gang lowered his head, a little frustrated. David walked up to Wang Gang, patted him on the shoulder and said, How could that be? I believe you can do better. Yes, that's enough. We've finished talking. I'm leaving now. You don't have to pay the rent for now. You can pay it when you have money. Then Wang Gang left. He walked to the side of the road and hailed a taxi. Let's go to Xiaomao Laudi convenience store. Okay. After Wang Gang left, David gently locked the door, then slowly walked up to the second floor and returned to his warm home. As soon as he entered the door, an alluring aroma hit him in the face, which made him speed up his pace. Eve, what are you doing? David asked curiously, with a hint of warmth in his voice. You're back. Eve's voice came from the kitchen, sounding a little surprised. I'm cooking. David smiled, and a warm feeling surged in his heart. He walked to the kitchen door, looked at Eve's busy figure, and couldn't help but exclaimed, It smells so good. It seems like I'm in for a treat tonight. Eve turned around and smiled sweetly at him, then continued to work. After a while, she brought the cooked dishes to the table one after another. Each dish was delicious and mouth-watering. Try it and see if it tastes good. David sat down. The two began to enjoy this wonderful dinner. The dishes tasted delicious, as if they were the result of Eve's careful cooking. David took a bite of the dish Eve made and was immediately conquered by the delicious flavor, with an expression of surprise on his face. It's so delicious! He couldn't help but exclaim, his voice full of praise for Eve. Eve couldn't help but blush when she heard David's praise. Really, as long as it tastes good? She responded softly, with a hint of embarrassment and shyness in her voice. After lunch, the two sat on the sofa and watched TV quietly. There were relaxing and cheerful programs playing on TV, creating a peaceful and harmonious atmosphere for them. Suddenly, David broke the silence and asked, Does your school have holiday homework? There was some concern and curiosity in his tone. Eve was stunned for a moment, then turned to look at David with a look of confusion in her eyes. Yes, what's wrong? She asked. David sighed and frowned. Sure enough, I knew Wang Gang was up to no good. There was a hint of dissatisfaction in his tone. Eve looked at David's helpless expression, and a strange feeling surged in her heart. She asked softly, What's wrong? Nothing. I just heard someone say your school doesn't have homework during the summer vacation. I don't believe it, so I'm asking you. Really? Eve had a worried look on her face, as if she was worried about the three women before. There was a hint of uneasiness in her eyes, which made David feel distressed. David keenly captured the change in Eve's facial expression. He gently held Eve's hand and gently comforted her. Don't worry, they won't do anything to you as long as I'm here. His voice was firm and powerful, like a warm current flowing into Eve's heart. Eve raised her head and looked into David's determined eyes. The worries in her heart seemed to be relieved a little. She nodded gently and said softly, "Hmm." Although it was only a simple word, it contained endless trust and reliance. At this moment, David suddenly burst into laughter. He pointed at the TV screen and said with a smile, "Why would a group of pigs go down to the river? Ha ha ha." His laughter was so clear and pleasant that Eve couldn't help but laugh along. Eve couldn't help laughing as she watched the funny scenes on the TV screen. Her mood became relaxed and happy at this moment, and the heavy atmosphere disappeared in an instant. She looked up at David, her eyes sparkling with gratitude, and whispered, "Thank you, David." David just tapped Eve's head gently and said, "Silly girl. We are a family. What are you thanking me for?" There was a hint of doting in his tone. Eve felt warm inside after hearing this. She raised her head, looked into David's serious eyes, and asked softly, "Are we a family?" "Certainly." Chapter 21 Confession. When it was afternoon, David reopened the door of the shop and waited quietly for customers. "Boss, do you have an electric fan?" An old man came to the door. He was wearing casual clothes, holding a red plastic bag in his hand, and had a bald spot on his head. "Of course," said David. Then Chu introduced the electric fans on the shelf to the old man. "Look at this one. Although it's a little old, it has become indestructible after my new transformation." David in disbelief. Of course, no one is cheated. In fact, after David dealt with the three women, the system would allow him to gain the talent for repair and transformation that night, so any waste would become sturdy and durable as long as it passed through David's hands. Then he plugged in the electric fan and showed the old man the gear position and wind speed. After hearing what David said, the old man nodded with satisfaction and asked, "How much is this?" David looked at the old man's sincere eyes and couldn't help but hesitate. He raised 5 fingers and said softly, 5,000. When the old man heard this, his face changed instantly. He looked at David in horror and shouted, "What? 5,000? Why don't you just go and rob him?" David looked at the old man's horrified expression and felt a little guilty. He smiled helplessly and explained, "Do you think I'm worth this price?" The old man became even angrier after hearing what David said. He waved his arms and shouted, 500 is not enough. How can you cheat an old man like this?" David looked at the old man's angry expression and felt helpless. He could only try to lower the price and said softly, 50. When the old man heard this, his expression instantly eased. He looked at David in surprise and asked in disbelief, "Really? It's so cheap." David nodded, smiled, and said, "Of course it's true." After hearing what David said, the old man smiled with satisfaction and nodded in agreement. "Your expression changes so quickly," David said. "Packed." Then David looked at him again and asked curiously, "Old man, I see you surf the internet every day." The old man was a little surprised when he heard David's words. He nodded and admitted, "Yes, I do surf the internet frequently." Then the old man smiled and said, "Don't look at me as old. I am a progressive old man. I can live a better life only if I keep up with the development of the times." David couldn't help but admire the old man's words. He smiled and asked, "Oh, how cool is that?" The old man looked at David's wretched expression, smiled, and said, "Of course, you know." After the old man left, Eve slowly walked down from upstairs. She saw David standing there and walked over. "There you are," Eve whispered. David looked at Eve, and a warm feeling surged in his heart. He asked with concern, "What's wrong?" Eve looked aside and whispered, "I missed you." There was a hint of shyness in her voice. David was shocked when he heard this. He took a deep breath and tried to calm down. He thought to himself, calm down. This is normal. This is normal. Is that so? The atmosphere became a little strange at this moment. There was an ambiguous and tense atmosphere between the two of them, as if there was an indescribable emotion in the air. "By the way, let's go buy some food." David tried to change the subject. David and Eve walked into the convenience store and saw the girl still sitting there, holding her phone in her hand, watching videos intently. "Shopping," David said lightly. The girl didn't even look up and waved her hand impatiently. "Get your things inside." David frowned, looked at Eve, and walked towards the shelf. He picked up a few snacks and walked to the cashier to pay. The girl still didn't look up, but just operated the cash register mechanically. David put the snacks on the counter, and the girl took a look and quoted a price. David paid, took the change and shopping bag, turned around, and prepared to leave. Eve followed him, and they walked out of the convenience store. "She's still the same," David said. As night fell and the lights came on, David and Eve made some dinner in their simple kitchen. Although it was simple, they still enjoyed it. After dinner, they sat on the sofa in the living room and rested for a while. There was only a dim table lamp on in the living room, creating a quiet and warm atmosphere for the two of them. After a long time, David felt a little sleepy and went back to his room, and Eve followed him. Then David turned around and asked, "Will you sleep together tonight?" "Well," Eve said with a hint of shyness in her tone. "Then let's go together." Eve lay beside David on the bed, looking at him quietly. Her eyes were gentle and warm, as if they could penetrate his heart. David felt Eve's gaze. He turned his head, looked at her, and said, "Don't look at me like that. I feel embarrassed." There was a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "Well, you want to know why it jumped?" Eve's words were on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't finish them. David seemed to understand what Eve was going to say, and then said with concern, "If I can get to know you better, then I want to." Eve's childhood was spent in tears and fear. After being trafficked to a remote mountain area, she not only suffered beatings and scoldings from her adoptive parents, but also had to face endless loneliness and despair. In that barren land, she grew tenaciously like an unattended small tree. Her excellent grades could not change her adoptive parents' indifference towards her. The birth of her younger brother exacerbated her miserable situation, and she became worthless in the eyes of her adoptive parents. In order to go to school, she had to earn her own tuition fees. She helped others herd cattle during the day and studied hard in a dilapidated house at night. She thought she could get away from all this by going to high school. However, her background made her the target of ridicule and bullying. Even though she was the top student in her grade, she did not receive the attention and respect she deserved. And because she didn't bring any gifts, the teacher ignored her. She could only endure it all silently, her heart filled with endless sadness. It wasn't until the adoptive parents took my younger brother out for a trip that the accident happened. They left this world forever, leaving Eve alone to face this cruel world. When the landlord heard the news, he had no sympathy and kicked her out of the house directly. All that was left on her was a coin with her name engraved on it. She gave the coin to a beggar on the road, and in despair, she chose to jump into the river to end her life. She stood by the river, looking at the turbulent waves, her heart filled with endless fear and despair. She felt she had reached her wit's end and could no longer endure the pain and humiliation, so she jumped into the river. The rushing river water washed him away in an instant. She struggled to float to the surface, but sank deeper and deeper. Just when she thought she could finally end it all, a hand suddenly grabbed her and pulled her up with force. She opened her eyes and saw a strange man. The man's eyes were firm and powerful. He wrapped Eve in clothes, making her feel warm and safe. Eve's tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked at David, her deep eyes flashing with determination. Her voice was trembling and weak, as if it would be drowned by tears at any time. "Thank you. Thank you for saving me at that time, saving the inferior, weak, and desperate me." Eve's words were like a sharp sword, piercing David's heart deeply. He couldn't believe that the girl in front of him had suffered such great hardship and pain. David stroked her hair gently and said softly, "Don't be afraid. Everything will be fine." His voice was low and powerful, like a warm breeze that blew away the haze in Eve's heart. Eve leaned in David's arms, feeling his strong chest and warm embrace. Her tears couldn't stop flowing. David didn't sleep all night. Chapter 22, Clothing Store. The first ray of sunlight in the morning penetrates the window, gently caressing every corner of the room, bringing warmth and tranquility. David slowly opened his sleepy eyes, and what came into view was Eve's quiet and peaceful face. He couldn't help but stretch out his fingers and gently touch her cheek, feeling the unique softness and warmth. Soft David's voice was doting and gentle. However, when his eyes fell on the tears in the corners of Eve's eyes, he couldn't help but feel an inexplicable heartache. Those tear marks recorded her previous sadness and fear. David gently took Eve into his arms and let her head rest on his shoulder. His heartbeat gradually quickened, as if he wanted to pass on his strength to her. He wanted to tell her that no matter what she was going through, he would be by her side and help her through it all. Eve seemed to feel David's warmth and strength. She slowly opened her eyes and looked at his face. Tears were gleaming in her eyes, but there was no more despair and fear from last night. She knew she had found the person she could rely on. Thank you, David. Although Eve's voice was still a little hoarse, it was full of gratitude and trust. David smiled and shook his head. You're welcome. This is what I should do. His eyes were firm and affectionate, as if he wanted to engrave Eve's figure in his heart forever. Eve blushed and buried herself shyly in David's arms. David felt the softness of Eve's body, and his body temperature rose slightly unconsciously. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his excitement. This doesn't seem so bad, David whispered, with a hint of suppressed emotion in his voice. Eve seemed to feel the changes in David's body at this time. She raised her head slightly and touched David's forehead curiously. What's wrong with you? Why are you so hot? There was a hint of worry in her voice. David pretended to be calm and tried his best to make his voice sound calm. Maybe it's because the weather is too hot. He tried to hide his true feelings with a joke. Really? Eve asked worriedly. Yeah. David nodded, trying to smooth it over. Then David stroked Eve's cheek and said softly, Okay, then you take a rest. I'll go prepare breakfast. When you wake up, we'll eat together. Eve heard this, and a hint of reluctance flashed in her eyes. I want to go with you, Eve said with a hint of coquettishness in her voice. David turned his head and saw Eve's cute appearance. He couldn't help but smile. Okay. After they were ready, they went out together and stepped into the bustling downtown. The hustle and bustle of the early morning is still there, and the aroma of breakfast stalls fills the streets and alleys, making people want to stop. David asked with concern, Eve, what do you want to eat? Let's go buy it together. Eve thought for a moment, then said, tofu buns. David nodded, took Eve's hand, and walked towards the stall they had been to before. They walked through the crowd and came to the stall. David shouted, Boss, 5 tofu buns. The boss looked up at them and said with a smile, Hey, why are there 2 of you here today? That's rare. It's been a month since you've been here together. David smiled awkwardly. Really? Maybe I forgot. He looked back at Eve, only to see her smiling and shaking her head. They took the tofu buns handed over by the boss and found a place to sit down. Eve took a bite of the tofu bun and smiled with satisfaction. It's delicious. David looked at her with eyes full of doting. If you like, I will bring you here to eat every day in the future. Eve felt warm at heart when she heard this. She looked up at David with happiness shining in her eyes. After breakfast, David took Eve to a clothing store. The lighting inside the store was soft, and a variety of new clothes were displayed, attracting the attention of many customers. David looked at Eve and said with a smile, School is about to start. I'll bring you here to buy some clothes and I'll buy some too. Eve looked hesitant after hearing this. She held David's clothes and lowered her head, seeming reluctant to go in. Forget it, she said in a low voice. David noticed her uneasiness and asked with concern, What's wrong? Did something happen? Eve was silent for a while. Then she said, It will get damaged if you buy it. David heard this. His pupils trembled, and there was a hint of anger in his eyes. He knew Eve must be recalling the unpleasant experience from before. He took a deep breath, adjusted his mentality, and pretended to be calm and said, It won't happen as long as I'm here. Eve looked up and saw David's determined eyes. A warm feeling welled up in her heart. She nodded and agreed to David's proposal. The 2 walked into the clothing store and picked out some clothes that suited them. David carefully matched them for Eve, making sure she was comfortable and looked good in them. Then, David picked a white shirt and a JK skirt from the shelf. He walked to Eve with the clothes and asked with a smile, Would you like to try this one? Eve looked at the skirt in David's hand, and a hint of anticipation flashed in her eyes. She asked softly, Is the skirt for wearing at home? David seemed stumped by the question. He thought for a moment and then answered, You can wear it anywhere. Eve looked disappointed when she heard this. She shook her head and said, Then I don't want it. David looked at her in confusion and asked, Why? Eve hesitated for a moment, then leaned close to David's ear and whispered, Because of me. I just want to wear it for you to see. David heard this. His face instantly turned red all the way to his neck. He was stunned and at a loss for a moment. He had never thought that Eve would express her feelings so frankly. His heart was pounding as if it was going to jump out of his chest. So, do you want to see me in this dress? David came back to his senses, took a deep breath, and nodded. He knew that it would be unmanly to refuse him at this moment, so he nodded, his eyes full of anticipation and excitement, as if he couldn't wait to see Eve wearing that dress. Although I know this is a bit perverted, but then again, I guess it's okay for me to just take a look. Then the two of them picked out some casual clothes, and Eve took some casual short-sleeved shirts and trousers, and then went home. When they got home, David couldn't wait to put on the white shirt and JK's skirt for Eve. Eve stood in front of the mirror, turned around, and asked, "How is it?" David looked at Eve's graceful figure and fresh and refined temperament, his eyes sparkling with admiration. He walked up to her, hugged her gently, and said, "Very beautiful, really beautiful." Chapter 23, Shingi Middle School. Eve was a little surprised by David's action. Her heartbeat quickened, and her cheeks flushed slightly. She lowered her head and whispered, "Really?" David looked at Eve's shy appearance and couldn't help feeling pity in his heart. He gently lifted Eve's chin so that she could look him in the eye. His eyes were firm and sincere as he said, "Of course, you have always been beautiful in my eyes." However, David suddenly realized that his actions were a bit too impulsive. He quickly let go of her hand and said awkwardly, "Sorry, I didn't mean it." Eve shook her head and smiled. "No, it's okay." David fled back to his room and dived into bed, feeling mixed emotions. He lay on the bed, his hands behind his head, looking at the ceiling, his mind full of thoughts. "What was I doing just now?" he muttered to himself, with a regretful expression on his face. He thought of his impulsive behavior towards Eve just now and couldn't help feeling a little guilty. However, when he closed his eyes, Eve's lovely appearance lingered in his mind. Her smile, her eyes, and her every move made his heart beat fast. What Eve's reaction would be if he had not been so impulsive and treated her gently. This conflicting mentality made David very upset. He tossed and turned. Then David looked at the time. It was almost time for school to start. He immediately remembered what happened when Eve bought clothes and couldn't help but start to worry. What if she gets bullied here again? It hurts so much. He felt helpless. If only there was some way to get into their school. But before that, I have to solve the problem of the recycling station. After all, I can't always be there to repair it. Suddenly, with a ding sound, a blue light appeared in front of him. "Oh, you finally came. It's been more than a month since the last time I came." But the system did not respond to David. Only 3 cold options popped up. Use all points to obtain 3 options. Currently have 3,085 points. Choice 1. Immediately obtain a life form with all the host skills. The life form will always be loyal to the host and can take care of its own food, clothing, shelter, and transportation. Choice 2. Obtain the status of a student of Star City. Option 3. Permanently enhance all body functions by 10%. David looked at the options in front of him and fell into deep thought. If you choose the first one, you won't have to work anymore. And the second one can solve problems in schools. As for the third one, 10% doesn't seem to be of much use. Even if you have 1 hour, it will only add 6 minutes at most, which is not very useful. After careful consideration, David finally chose the first one. It's most enjoyable when you don't have to work. Just after I made my choice, there was a knock on the door downstairs. David went out and saw Eve was also getting ready to go out. David then stopped Eve. "I'll go. You can go watch TV." "All right." Then David came to the first floor and saw a man about 1.75 meters tall, wearing a black suit, standing at the door. "Excuse me, do you need a repairman here?" When he heard the word repairman, David realized that this was the free worker assigned to him by the system. Yes, of course." Then the man walked into the store and sat on a stool. He looked around and found that there were no rooms being repaired. "Where is my workplace? Is it so direct? It's worthy of being a system," David thought to himself. David then took the man to the scrapyard and introduced the repair room. But the man didn't seem to listen and was busy with his own work. "Didn't you say you were loyal to me? Are you always changing jobs?" Then David came to the man with questions. "Will you change jobs?" After hearing this, the man simply said, "No, and I will help you sell the repaired items. Before that, I hope you can hand over the key to the first floor of the store to me." Then David handed him the keys and planned to pay him 3,000 yuan a month. Although he might not need those things, David felt that he could do without them, but I could not give them to him. The man then concentrated on studying the waste. David came home and found Eve sitting on the sofa watching TV, and then he said, "Eve, I'm going to be out for a minute. I'll be back before noon." Eve also wanted to go, but David didn't let her go and just asked her to stay at home. After going out, David made a phone call. "Wang Gang, please accompany me to your school. I want to take a look." After hearing this, Wang Gang immediately agreed and said, Are you planning to ask your little girl's sister about this in advance? That's about right. Although she's much stronger now, I'm still a little worried. Then wait for me. I'll be there soon. After a long time, a taxi stopped in front of David. Get in the car. I'll take you there. Wang Gang's face was filled with smiles, as if he had encountered something happy. David looked at Wang Gang's expression and asked, "What good thing happened? Tell me about it, brother." Wang Gang smiled proudly. "It's okay to tell you. Tell me quickly." David seemed a little excited, with a gossipy look on his face. "The guy I like asked me to go hiking tomorrow." When he heard about climbing a mountain, David smiled without knowing why. "What are you laughing at? This is the first time she asked me to go hiking." No, I just suddenly thought of some funny things." David explained. "Really?" Wang Gang didn't quite believe what David said. "Of course, but why are you so happy about just climbing a mountain?" David said, "Oh, you don't know? Girls will definitely get tired after climbing a mountain. When she gets tired, I can carry her up and let her know how charming I am." "Ha." David just shook his head helplessly and then said, "Imagination is beautiful. Reality is cruel. Maybe you will be tired before her." "Impossible. Absolutely impossible." As they chatted, the two of them soon arrived at Shinkong City No. 1 Middle School. The high school campus during the holidays presents a quiet and peaceful atmosphere, in sharp contrast to the usual hustle and bustle. The trees on campus swayed gently in the breeze, and the sunlight shone through the gaps between the leaves onto the ground, creating mottled light and shadows. Occasionally, a few birds sing happily on the branches, adding a bit of vitality to this quiet afternoon. The teaching building was empty, and the windows of the classrooms were open, as if showing their tranquility to the outside world. The desks and chairs in the classrooms were neatly arranged, and the blackboard still had traces of the last class. Everything seemed so quiet and orderly. The playground has lost its former liveliness. The basketball stand stands there quietly, and the lines on the court are clearly visible in the sun. Some students are sunbathing, chatting or reading on the grass, enjoying their rare leisure time. "Let's go." Wang Gang came to the gate and saw a face recognition device at the door. "Why are you treating school like work?" David asked helplessly. "Oh, that's right. This thing is only used during holidays. It's not used on other days. To facilitate students' access?" Clever. Then Wang Gang glanced at his face, and the closed door opened instantly. "You go in first." But David shook his head and said confidently, "Maybe there is someone who is as handsome as me?" "Tisk." Wang Gang complained, then walked in. After Wang Gang entered, the door closed instantly. "Okay, it's my turn next." Then David stood there, and the door opened. Wang Gang's eyes widened at this moment, with a look of disbelief on his face. David looked at the information on the screen and fell into deep thought. David, Class 1, Senior 3. Chapter 24, I'm actually a student. The two looked at each other in shock. "Fuck, aren't you a beggar? How come you are a student of our school?" Wang Gang asked in an incredible tone. "You ask me. Who should I ask?" David retorted. "Then now. What else can I do? I have to accept the reality. But it's okay this way." David looked happy. "Not at all. I originally thought you were a beggar whom no one wanted, but now you have become my senior." Wang Gang lowered his head, full of disappointment. David walked up to Wang Gang, patted his shoulder, and said in a frivolous tone, "Don't be so disappointed. Besides, didn't you also be a beggar for a whole morning?" "Tisk, that's just what I thought." Wang Gang tried to explain. Okay. Take me to see the environment of the third year of high school." Then they came to the teaching building. The door of the building was locked, and there was no sign of it being opened. "What should we do?" David said. "How should I know? Why don't you go back and leave it there so that you can get in by yourself? Then you can come whenever you want." At this moment, an idea popped up in David's mind. "Do you think I can come back to study?" Wang Gang just shook his head. "You should ask the principal about this matter." "I don't know either. Besides, I don't know why you didn't study before." "That's right, let's talk about it in a few days." On the way home, "Have you finished your homework?" David suddenly asked Wang Gang. Wang Gang was stunned for a moment, then reacted. "Ah, didn't I say there was no homework?" There was a hint of helplessness in his voice. David smiled softly after hearing this. Okay. After all, we are all people who like to create miracles." The two continued walking forward and soon arrived at the door of the shop. David in the taxi. "Then I'll go first." David nodded. "Well, be safe." When he got home, he was greeted by a tempting aroma. David followed the aroma to the kitchen, where he saw Eve busying around the stove. Her figure looks particularly warm under the light, like a beautiful landscape. Is that little Eve cooking again? David said softly, with admiration and anticipation in his eyes. He walked closer to Eve, watching her skillfully operate various kitchen utensils, and couldn't help but exclaimed, "Let's do it together." His voice was full of enthusiasm and anticipation. Eve raised her head, looked at David, and said with a smile, "Okay." Her smile was as warm as the spring breeze, which warmed David's heart. So the two of them started to work together, cooperating perfectly. As the spatulas flew, delicious dishes gradually appeared before their eyes. Their laughter and conversation blended together to form a beautiful melody. At lunchtime, the two of them sat around the dining table and enjoyed the delicious food prepared by Eve and David. Every dish was delicious and mouth-watering. The two of them ate with gusto and laughter. David cleaned up the dishes and sat down on the sofa, enjoying this rare, quiet time. He touched his stomach, a satisfied smile on his face. That hearty lunch fully nourished his body and mind. His gaze unconsciously turned to Eve, who was sitting next to him, with a questioning gleam in his eyes. He asked softly, "Didn't I say you would do it when I got back?" There was a hint of doubt in his voice, which also revealed his concern for Eve. Eve smiled slightly, her eyes twinkling with tenderness. She shook her head slightly and responded softly, "Well, but if you can see someone has prepared dinner for you when you come back, you will be very happy." Her tone was full of understanding and consideration, as if she could read David's inner desire. David felt a warm current in his heart. He looked at Eve's serious yet gentle expression and suddenly understood her good intentions. He reached out and gently held Eve's hand, with a firm light in his eyes. "Thank you, Eve." Suddenly, Eve's face turned red. "No, it's okay. This is what I should do." Then Eve broke free from David's hand and said, "I'm going to take a rest." "Go ahead." After returning to the room, Eve touched her hot cheeks. "What's wrong with me?" Eve left. David returned to the shop on the first floor and found that there were several refurbished items on the shelves. Then I saw the repairman sitting at the door of the store. "Did you fix all of this?" "Yes, and that's not all." The repairman then pointed to the money box at the front desk. David opened it and found that there were several large bills inside. "You sold all these?" I sold more in 1 day than I did in 3 days. I am worthy of being the person given by the system." David sighed in his heart. Then David said, "That's enough. Go back and take a nap. Come back at 2 p.m. The repairman shook his head and said, "No, I'm just sitting here to rest, so there's no need to go back." David just smiled helplessly. "Is that so?" It seems like he doesn't have to worry about it himself. Afterwards, David returned home and opened the door very carefully, fearing that the silence would be broken. He had an indescribable urge in his heart, wanting to confirm whether Eve had fallen asleep peacefully. He told himself that it was just out of concern for her and nothing else. He walked carefully through the living room and came to the door of Eve's room. He took a deep breath and gently opened the door, only to see sunlight pouring through the window onto Eve's quiet bed. He approached the bed cautiously and saw Eve lying quietly, seemingly immersed in a dream. David couldn't help but call softly, "Eve, are you asleep?" His voice was almost inaudible, for fear of disturbing Eve's sweet dream. However, Eve suddenly responded, "No." Her voice was clear and pleasant, which made David stunned. David was startled by Eve's answer. He took a few steps back, his heartbeat quickened, and an embarrassed look appeared on his face. He stammered, "Is that so?" He tried to hide his panic, but his voice trembled uncontrollably. "I can't sleep without you." Eve blushed, and there was a hint of shyness in her tone. He looked down at Eve and could clearly see a blush on her face. "Really?" David sat down next to Eve and stroked her head gently. Eve's little hand unconsciously held David's hand. "Then I'll stay with you for a while. I'll leave after you fall asleep." Eve nodded and lay quietly on the bed. David looked at Eve in front of him, his heart pounding. So cute. Chapter 25, I hope to give her a surprise. After a long time, the sound of calm breathing was heard, and the tender little hand holding David loosened. David gently stroked Eve's long, smooth hair and thought to himself, "Is she asleep?" Seeing that Eve didn't react, David stood up carefully, walked out of the room, and closed the door carefully. David went to the bathroom and washed his face, but suddenly saw clothes placed aside without drying. "What is this?" David picked up a piece of clothing, took a look, and immediately put the clothes back in. I thought it wasn't in the washing machine, so it's this." "Forget it. let her hang the clothes to dry by herself. But David suddenly remembered that if the clothes were not dried in time, they might emit a strange smell that would be unbearable. Just this once. That's right. Just this once. Then David came to the balcony and hung up the clothes one by one. While hanging the clothes, David looked at them carefully with his eyes, squinting, and his hands were very tiptoeing. After a while, the clothes were neatly hung on the balcony. After everything was done, David took out his mobile phone, intending to watch some videos, but David's current mobile phone was completely unusable except for playing with bubbles, penguins, and making phone calls. Forget it, I'll go get another one. I have some money on me now. David then headed to the city with his $2,000. On a hot summer day, the sun hangs high in the sky like a huge fireball, emitting blazing light. Its light shone through the window and onto the floor, as if to scorch everything. Even if you hide under the shade of a tree, you can still feel the heat wave coming towards you, making you want to find a cooler place. Walking on the street is like being in a huge oven. The road surface is so hot that it seems like every step is on hot coals. Heat waves rose from the ground and mixed with water vapor in the air to create a suffocating feeling. Even if a breeze blows, it only brings a brief coolness, which is then replaced by heat. In the afternoon, the sun is at its strongest. David was walking on the street. The summer sun seemed to burn everything. David was walking under the sun. Sweat was running down his cheeks, and his clothes were soaked. Sweat began to flow down from the forehead, armpits, and back. The sweat soaked the clothes and stuck to the skin, making people feel sticky and very uncomfortable. In addition to direct sunlight, heat waves are also one of the reasons why David sweats profusely. The heat wave was like a huge steam bath, making it difficult for David to breathe and sweat pouring out uncontrollably. I should have stayed at home in this kind of weather. I shouldn't have come out if I had known. David walked under the shade of a tree, trying to find a chance of survival. But it was all in vain in the end, as he underestimated the power of the sun at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Are we almost there? Finally, after his unremitting efforts, he came to a rice store, where rice refers to a brand of mobile phones. He stepped into a store and instantly felt a cool breeze. This coolness is like a natural air conditioner, making people feel comfortable and relaxed instantly. The air in the store seems to be filtered, fresh and cool. It gently brushes across the skin, taking away the heat from the body and giving people a refreshing and comfortable feeling. Even in the hot summer, the temperature inside the store is always kept in a pleasant range. Awesome. It's so awesome. If I could, I'd like to stay here forever. David felt the coolness brought by the air conditioner, and it seemed that he had forgotten why he came here. Wait, David seemed to remember something and patted his head. I'm here to buy a mobile phone. Then he came to the counter. Is there a cell phone suitable for students? David didn't come here to buy one for himself, but for Eve. Some. The clerk then took out several mobile phones and placed them in front of David. Look at this Xiaomi J07, equipped with a flagship processor and 12 plus 256 for only $19.99. David looked at the mobile phone in front of him. The appearance design was simple and elegant, and it used an aluminum alloy nano-injection molding middle frame, which not only improved the strength of the whole machine, but also felt very good. The screen protector glass is the 5th generation glass, which not only has good protection, but also has a hydrophobic film coating on the surface, which can provide a comfortable and smooth user experience. The back cover is made of glass, which not only feels comfortable, but also looks crystal clear. In addition, the rear camera decoration is also made of glass, which is integrated with the battery cover and has a suspended integrated design, which is very stylish. That's it. The clerk then packed the phone, and David handed the clerk 2,000 yuan in bills. David with wide eyes. At this time, another clerk sighed. I haven't seen it for a long time. At this time, another clerk slapped the clerk who had just been there. What are you talking about? Then he explained to David. We don't mean anything else. But before he could finish his words, David interrupted him. It's okay. It's okay. I haven't seen you for a long time. After all, in this era of mobile payment, everyone will feel emotional. Then David inserted Eve's phone card from his own phone into the phone. Then he asked the clerk to connect to the store's wireless hotspot, and then he downloaded several software he used on a daily basis and some photo-taking software. After all, girls all love beauty. Then I returned home under the scorching sun. David returned home. His clothes were already soaked with sweat, as if he had just climbed out of the water. He frowned and smelled himself. The strong smell of sweat made him feel unbearable. Take a bath. Take a bath, he said to himself, his heart filled with urgent need. He casually placed his phone on the table and quickly walked to the bathroom to clean himself up. In the bathroom, David turned on the shower and let the warm water wash over his body. He closed his eyes and enjoyed the refreshing feeling brought by the water, as if all his fatigue and sweat were washed away. He carefully scrubbed his body with shower gel, letting every cell regain new vitality. When he took a shower and put on clean clothes, he felt that the whole world became fresh. After returning to the living room, he picked up his phone, opened the bubble on Eve's phone, gently clicked the Add Friend button, and then saved his contact information on the phone. This way, they can contact each other more conveniently. Then, David opened the photo of Eve that he had secretly taken. It was a beautiful moment that he had captured by chance. Eve's face was filled with a bright smile, warming people's hearts like the sunshine. David looked at the photo and couldn't help feeling sweet in his heart. He gently clicked the Set Wallpaper option and set the photo as her wallpaper. After everything was done, David gently placed the phone next to Eve's pillow. He imagined Eve's surprised expression when she saw the photo, and he was filled with anticipation. He hoped that this small gesture could bring Eve some happiness and warmth. That's all. Chapter 26, the first group photo. Ah! Eve stretched and sat up from the bed. She rubbed her sleepy eyes and looked out the window. It was already dark outside, and the afterglow of the sunset had disappeared into the sky. David, she murmured softly, her eyes observing her surroundings. Not here. Eve suddenly panicked and rushed out of the room, forgetting to put on her shoes. Her pair of white and tender feet felt a little cold when she stepped on the ground. When she came out of the room, she heard the sound of cutting vegetables coming from the kitchen and immediately relaxed. Then she went back to the room and put on her shoes and suddenly found a mobile phone next to her pillow. Eve picked up the phone, thinking that David had put it there for her to check the time. But when she looked at it, she found that this phone was not the one David used, but a brand new one. Have you changed it to a new one? But she didn't think too much about it. She just picked up the phone and prepared to hand it to David. When they reached the door, Eve hesitated for a moment. She wanted to see if there were any secrets in David's phone, but she felt that this was not a good idea since she didn't have David's consent. I want to see. Finally, Eve couldn't resist the temptation. Without any hesitation, she opened her mobile phone screen, and what came in her eyes was a cute photo of Eve. Suddenly, Eve's face turned slightly red, and she felt a little happy inside. Then she clicked on the main page to open the bubble, but when she opened the bubble, there was an unread message. She felt something was wrong at this time, because she had seen David's bubble avatar, and now that avatar was lying in the chat bar. Eve clicked on her personal homepage and found that the bubble was logged in with her own bubble account. Usually her bubble account was on David's phone. She immediately returned to the chat bar and clicked on the unread message. You woke up. Although I don't know if this is a surprise, I still hope you'll be happy when you see it. I may not be able to give you anything good now, but maybe I can in the future. Forget it. I'd better not make this promise. It would be embarrassing if you didn't see it. Eve seemed speechless for a moment. Her eyes were covered with a layer of mist, because it was the first time she received a gift. Her expression was filled with mixed feelings, a mixture of joy for the gift and regret that she had never experienced such care before. This gift is not only an object in her hands, but also a precious thought that makes her feel valued and loved. Eve rushed out of the room, excited, and hugged David, who was cooking in the kitchen. David was startled by this sudden action. He put down the spatula in his hand, turned around, and asked with concern, "What's wrong? Did something happen?" However, Eve did not answer immediately. She hugged David tightly, as if she wanted to put all her emotions into this hug. Her body trembled slightly, as if she had 1,000 words to say, but at this moment, she could only express her inner fluctuations in this silent way. David sensed that something was wrong with Eve, so he patted her on the back gently, trying to calm her down. "What's wrong? Can you tell me what's going on?" David asked gently, and Eve just said 2 short words. "Fool." After saying that, Eve ran back to the living room and lay down on the sofa. When leaving, David saw the new phone in her hand and suddenly realized what was going on. "As long as you like it." Ding-ling-ling. Ding-ling-ling. At this moment, David's cell phone suddenly rang. He picked up the phone and saw 5 big words, "Eve, little cutie," written on it. David quickly picked up the phone and asked gently, "What's wrong?" "I'm hungry." The voice was small and a little shy, and if you tasted it carefully, you could also feel a little bit of tsundere. Yes, it will be ready soon." David hung up the phone, feeling something was not right. Why does this tone sound weird? After a while, The delicious meal was ready. Based on his understanding of Eve over the past month, David already knew what kind of food Eve liked to eat. So after taking a shower, he hurried to the vegetable market to buy vegetables as the sun was about to set. Eve looked at the table full of her favorite dishes and felt extremely warm and touched. Her eyes couldn't help but become moist, not only because of the temptation of the delicious food, but also because of David's care and love for her. On this warm night, she felt the warmth and happiness of home. She recalled every moment she had spent with David. The time they had spent together seemed to have turned into beautiful paintings that slowly unfolded in her mind. She looked at David's busy figure, her heart filled with gratitude and love. She knew that this man had put in a lot of effort and thought to make her happy, and this feeling of being loved made her feel extremely precious and happy. She took a deep breath and tasted the delicious food on the table. Every bite was full of sweetness and satisfaction. She knew that this night would be an unforgettable memory for her because it was full of love, warmth, and touching moments. After dinner, Eve held David's hand with a look of embarrassment and anticipation on her face. She said softly, "I want to change the wallpaper." David was slightly stunned after hearing this. He looked at the girl in front of him with some doubt in his eyes. "Why? Isn't this pretty?" Eve lowered her head, clasped her hands tightly together, and her voice trembled a little. "But that's not a photo with you." There was a hint of uneasiness and expectation in her voice, as if she was waiting for David's answer. David felt a warm current in his heart. He looked at the girl in front of him with a gentle light in his eyes. He understood what Eve meant. She wanted their photo to become the new wallpaper so that she would feel happy and blessed every time she saw it. David looked at Eve with a smile and rubbed her head gently. "Okay, let's change the wallpaper." His voice was full of pampering and tenderness, making Eve feel extremely relieved and happy. Eve raised her head and looked at David's smiling face, her heart filled with joy and sweetness. "So, how are we going to shoot it?" David asked Eve what she meant. Eve already had a lot of ideas in her mind at this time. Then she went back to the room, put on the clothes chosen by David, and then returned to the sofa. Eve sat cross-legged next to David, her fair thigh accidentally touching David's thigh. "Calm down, calm down. I'm not a pervert. I'm not a pervert." David reminded himself again and again to calm down, but he still couldn't help but look at Eve's white thighs. "Okay, I'm a pervert." Then Eve put her head next to David's head, and their heads were close together. At this moment, Eve suddenly kissed David on the cheek, and as their skin touched, the sound of taking a photo was heard from the phone. Crack! After the shoot, Eve looked at David lovingly. "It's better to shoot like this." Chapter 27, Memories to be Revealed. David stared at Eve with big eyes. "Hey, what is this?" Obviously, David hasn't figured out what's going on yet. David gently stroked the cheek after being kissed. The feeling this time was different from the last time, a feeling that was hard to describe. At this moment, his heart seemed to be about to jump out, and his heart rate reached 180. "What's wrong?" Eve asked quietly. "No, it's okay. I'm going to the bathroom." David stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at his face, which was flushed with nervousness and excitement, and couldn't help but smile bitterly. His heartbeat was still fast, as if he had just experienced a fierce battle. "Have I really been controlled by her?" David said to himself, his brows furrowed, his heart filled with confusion and bewilderment. He tried to find the answer in his memory, but every time he thought of Eve's bright eyes and gentle smile, his heart would beat uncontrollably. He shook his head, trying to shake off the confusion, and turned on the tap, running cold water over his face, trying to calm himself down. Eve's figure and the look on her face would always appear in his mind. "It's over. I can't calm down at all," David thought helplessly. He sat on the toilet lid, holding his head in his hands, trying to calm his mind. But the more he did this, the more irritated and uneasy he felt. He kept thinking about the way Eve looked at him just now. He couldn't describe the feeling. Was it admiration, love, or something else? He was not sure, and he didn't dare to guess. After a long time, David came out of the bathroom. He looked at the sofa and found that there was no one there. "Did you go to bed?" Then he picked up the phone on the coffee table, which contained an unread message. "Note, cute Eve. Wait a minute, remember to come." Followed by a shy expression. "Although I'm used to it, why do I feel something is wrong this time?" Afterwards, David washed up and tidied his appearance. He gently pushed open Eve's door, and the room was filled with a peaceful and warm atmosphere. The moonlight shone through the window onto Eve's bed. She lay there quietly, as if immersed in a sweet dream. David walked closer to the bed and looked at Eve's sleeping face quietly. Her face looked particularly soft in the moonlight. Her breathing was even and gentle, and he sat down gently beside the bed, not daring to disturb her rest. Eve's phone was still on, and when David was about to turn it off, he saw that the wallpaper had been changed to the one he had just taken. That seems like a good idea. Then David also lay down, and as soon as he lay down, Eve's soft body pressed tightly against David. David secretly sighed inwardly. Luckily, there is air conditioning. The next day, David was awakened by a hurried phone call. He immediately picked up the phone and then carefully walked out of the room to avoid disturbing Eve's rest. Hey, can't you let me sleep so early in the morning? Wang Gang's voice came from the other side. I have good news for you, which is bad news for me. What information? David asked puzzledly. School starts in 2 days. David said nonchalantly. I know, what's wrong? It's not this, it's the teacher. Wang Gang said excitedly. Teacher? What teacher? Before school starts, teachers have to arrive early. Then I checked you out, and the head teacher of the class you were in charge of was also there. Then what? You know why you were a student of this school. Now that the teacher is here, this is a good opportunity to find out the truth. David suddenly realized. Yes, I'll pack up and come right back. Okay, let's meet at the school gate. Afterwards, David prepared breakfast, sent Eve a message on his phone, and left a note on the table. If Eve got up and didn't look at her phone, she would notice the note on the table. After everything was ready, David took a taxi to Shinkong City number 1 middle school. Why did you come just now? I've been waiting for almost an hour. Wang Gang complained. Sorry, I prepared breakfast for my sister. David helplessly, and after a long while he managed to squeeze out a word. 6. 7. The rent is going up. The rent is going up. I can't take it anymore. No, my handsome, suave landlord brother. David with disgust. You are so disgusting. All right, let's get down to business. Tisk, all right. Wang Gang then told David what he knew. I asked someone to check the list of senior high school students in Shinkong City over the past 3 years. After my unremitting efforts, I finally found your name in a senior high school class 3 years ago. Wang Gang then sent the list to David. The first name on the list was clearly written with the word David. As everyone knew, this ranking was completely based on academic performance. Wang Gang, however, showed an unpleasant expression. I didn't expect it. You were actually the most powerful one at that time. It's so infuriating. David walked up to Wang Gang and patted him on the shoulder. Don't worry, I may not be as awesome as you now. Yeah, fake. Forget it, let's just raise the rent. David quickly said. No. You are just better than me. No one is as awesome as you. Hey, really? Really? Afterwards, Wang Gang sent him the list of head teachers of each class at that time. This is the list of homeroom teachers. I checked it and they are still in school. However, they seem to have been demoted for some reason 3 years ago and became ordinary teachers from head teachers. Why? How should I know? Okay, go and ask quickly. Wang Gang urged. Okay, but I want to ask, how did you get this information? Don't worry about it. It's not against the law anyway. Okay. Then David went into the school. David left. A girl walked up to Wang Gang and asked, Is this the beggar you mentioned? Why do I feel like I've seen him somewhere before? Is it true? Wang Gang asked doubtfully. It looks familiar, but don't think too much about it. Aren't we going hiking today? Yes. Let's go then, the girl said gently. David saw all of this because he wanted to go back to Wang Gang to ask where the office was, but he saw this scene instead. I think I've seen this girl somewhere before. Where is she? At this moment, David seemed to have thought of something. That's right. It's the girl from Kitty Oldie's convenience store. Chapter 28, Envy, Jealousy, and Hatred. Never mind. It has nothing to do with me anyway. David walked into the teaching building. He found that many of his classmates had already returned early. They were either sitting in the classroom reading books or busy cleaning. Looking at this scene, David couldn't help but feel a little confused. He walked to the door of the classroom and looked at the students who were studying hard inside, and a feeling of admiration welled up in his heart. He knew that these students were working hard for their studies, and he deeply admired their diligence and perseverance. However, when he saw some classmates cleaning, he couldn't help but frown. He thought to himself, I can understand coming early, but I can't understand cleaning, and I don't get paid for it. He felt that these students were working too hard, and there seemed to be no point in doing so. But just then, he noticed a classmate wiping the blackboard intently. Her movements were simple, but full of power and determination. David suddenly realized that these students were not cleaning for any reason, but just wanted to create a clean and tidy learning environment. Forget it, let's just hurry to the office. Just then, a female classmate walked past David, a tall high school girl with a tight face. Her height makes her stand out from the crowd, like a tall and graceful poplar tree. Her skin is fair and delicate, as if it has never been eroded by time, and her tight face is filled with youthful glow. Her eyes were as bright as stars, as if they could speak. Every time she talked to someone, she would listen carefully, nod in agreement, and laugh. Her lips are as red as cherries, and the slightly upturned corners of her mouth always reveal her inner joy and confidence. Her long hair was silky and smooth, falling naturally on her shoulders, fluttering gently in the breeze. She always wears her hair in a simple hairstyle, which makes her look refreshing and elegant. Her outfit is also very simple and generous, a white shirt with a pair of blue jeans, which is both comfortable and fashionable. She never pursues luxury and famous brands, but only focuses on dressing in her own style and taste. David stepped forward to stop her. This action was seen by the male classmates around him, who gritted their teeth and cast dissatisfied glances at him. Their faces were livid. Their eyes were full of hostility and jealousy. They whispered and attacked David with harsh words. "Here comes another idiot. Do you really think you can pursue her?" A tall boy sneered, his voice full of disdain and ridicule. "That's right. Don't you see your own status?" Another boy echoed, with a scornful smile on his face. "A toad wants to eat swan flesh." A thin boy sneered, his words full of sarcasm and ridicule. David ignored them after hearing these words, but just looked carefully at the tall girl in front of him. "She's pretty, but not as pretty as my Eve." At this time, the girl spoke. "Excuse me, what can I do for you?" the girl asked. "Nothing, I just want to ask where the office is. I want to find a teacher." The girl looked at David, and there was a hint of doubt in her eyes. David's appearance is indeed somewhat different from other students in this school. He dresses simply and neatly, without those popular elements and logos. "Are you the parent?" She couldn't help but ask, with a hint of tentativeness in her voice. David was slightly stunned, then smiled and said, "Do you think I look like that?" "How presumptuous." His tone was relaxed and humorous, as if he didn't care about the question. After hearing his answer, the girl smiled awkwardly. She realized that her question was indeed a bit presumptuous, so she quickly changed the subject. "Sorry, I just think you don't look like a student of this school." David didn't care about her apology. He smiled and said, "It's okay. I'm not a student of this school yet. I'm here to look for someone." After hearing his answer, the girl's eyes flashed with curiosity. "Looking for someone? Who are you looking for?" "Did you know?" David asked doubtfully. "Maybe, after all, I know all the teachers in the school," said the girl. "Really?" David then took out his mobile phone and looked at the list Wang Gang sent him. Found it, his name is Zhang Huihui. The girl looked down at the ground, searching for Zhang Huihui's memory in her mind. "I figured it out. Go to 315 on the third floor and look for him. He should be there." "Thank you." After saying that, David left. David's figure disappeared at the end of the corridor, leaving the girl standing there alone. The boys around her looked at her with jealousy in their eyes. They originally thought that this girl would only be interested in outstanding boys, but now it seems that their idea was not accurate. "Really? Why would she talk to him for so long?" a boy said dissatisfiedly. "Yeah, we're so nice to her, but she ignores us." Another boy echoed. After hearing what they said, the girl couldn't help feeling helpless. She just felt that David gave her a very special feeling, which made her want to talk to him more. She turned around to leave, but accidentally bumped into a boy. The boy's books were scattered all over the floor, and the girl quickly apologized and helped pick them up. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it," she whispered. The boy looked at her with a hint of surprise in his eyes. He originally thought that the girl would ignore him, but now it seems that he was wrong. "It's okay, it was my fault," the boy said with a smile. The girl looked at his smile and couldn't help feeling touched. She suddenly realized that everyone has their own unique charm and shining points. As long as you discover and appreciate them with your heart, you can find your own happiness. After picking up all the books on the floor, the boy thanked them and left. At this time, another girl walked up to the girl and looked at her in a mean way. "Why? Did that boy make our miss by Iran fall in love with him?" "No." "Really? But it wouldn't be bad if you liked him. After all, he is the eldest son of the Fan family, Fan Li Wei." "Sorry, I'm not planning on falling in love yet." Okay, I can't convince you, so let's go there now," the girl asked. "Library. Let's go then." At this time, David had arrived at room 315 on the third floor. David looked inside and saw only a middle-aged teacher sitting there. He wore black-framed glasses, had a trace of sadness in his eyes, and had a scar on his forehead. Then David walked in, came to the teacher, and asked, "Excuse me, is Teacher Zhang Huihui here?" The middle-aged man just looked up at him, but couldn't help but take a few steps back. Chapter 29. Knowing Everything. David looked at the actions of the middle-aged man in front of him and felt a sense of inexplicable strangeness. He originally thought that he was just here to understand some things, but he didn't expect to encounter such a situation. "I'm not dead. Why do you feel like you've seen a ghost?" David couldn't help but say, with a hint of teasing in his voice, trying to ease the tense atmosphere. However, the man in front of him didn't seem moved by his words. David tremblingly, his face filled with fear and anxiety. There was a deep fear in his eyes, as if he had seen something terrible. Why are you here?" The middle-aged man stammered, his voice trembling and weak, as if he would collapse at any time. "What the hell? Why can't it be here?" David thought to himself. He looked at the terrified man in front of him and couldn't help but feel a little funny. He originally thought that he was just here to deal with some minor matters, but he didn't expect to encounter such a situation. "Hey, what's your reaction?" David said helplessly. But the middle-aged man took out his cell phone from his pocket and quickly called the police. Seeing that something was wrong, David snatched the phone away. "Old man, why did you call the police?" The man just knelt on the ground and kowtowed to apologize. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." David looked at the old man in front of him, confused. "I didn't do anything." David then helped the man up and said, "Although you may have had some problems with me before, I am no longer the same person I used to be, so don't be afraid." "Really?" The man sat down on the stool tremblingly and slowly drank a sip of water. "Really?" David said, but it was just a polite remark. He just wanted to know what happened that year. At home, Eve got up from the bed and looked around and found that David was not around. She pouted, feeling a little dissatisfied. "I was left alone at home again. I ignored you." She got out of bed and went to the bathroom to brush her teeth and wash up. While brushing her teeth, she couldn't help but complain, "Big idiot." Although she was a little angry, there was a hint of coquettishness in her tone. After washing up, Eve came to the living room. She accidentally saw a note on the table with a few words written on it. "Breakfast is in the kitchen. Remember to eat when you get up, David." She picked up the note and read it carefully. Although the handwriting was a little sloppy, it was full of warmth and care. Eve's heart suddenly felt warm as she remembered David's hard work and care in preparing breakfast for her. "I will forgive you this time," she said to herself. Although David was not around, his love and care made her feel extremely warm and happy. At this time, the man was still confirming the authenticity of Chidian's words again and again. "You're really okay? Do I need to lie to an old man like you?" Although he was very unhappy about David calling him old, he didn't dare to say anything because the person standing in front of him was the one who almost sent him to hell. David accidentally saw him touching a female classmate in the office. But when David told the principal about this, the principal didn't believe it. He thought that such an excellent teacher like Zhang Huihui would never do such a thing. But since that day, Zhang Huihui has been deliberately suppressing and ostracizing David. Zhang Huihui's behavior made David feel very troubled and helpless. He didn't understand why he was treated like this. He began to doubt his own judgment, and even began to doubt whether he should stand up and expose Zhang Huihui's behavior. However, David did not give up. He decided to continue to stick to his beliefs and fight for justice. He began collecting evidence and looking for witnesses, hoping to find facts to prove Zhang Huihui's behavior. After a period of hard work, David finally collected enough evidence. He found some victims who were willing to come forward and testify against Zhang Huihui's actions. The evidence was sufficient to prove Zhang Huihui's guilt, and David decided to report the matter to the principal again. However, the principal called all the students who stood up, and they denied everything that had happened before in front of the principal. He felt a strong sense of dizziness coming over him, as if the whole world was spinning. He tried to steady himself, but his legs felt as heavy as lead and could not support his weight. The principal's voice rang in his ears, cold and ruthless. "David, you see, your accusation has not been proven. These students have denied your statement. What else do you have to say?" David's heart felt like it was being tightly gripped by an invisible hand, and the pain was so severe that he could hardly breathe. He felt an indescribable despair and anger. He didn't understand why these students betrayed him and why they denied the hurt they had suffered. He looked up at the principal, his eyes flashing with determination. "Principal, I know you may not believe me, but I can swear that everything I said is true. These students did report Zhang Hui's behavior to me before, but they were afraid of retaliation, so they didn't dare to stand up and testify. I can find other evidence to prove his crime." "David, you have to provide evidence when you speak. What makes you think they were threatened by Zhang Hui?" the principal said angrily. All of a sudden, David's sense of justice disappeared completely. He knew that nothing he did now would help, and he was just a student, and it was impossible for him to continue investigating. Finally, he decided to call the police and let them handle the matter. After he called the police, during the few days that the police were investigating, people kept stopping him on his way home and physically attacking him. But after he told these things to the police quickly arrested them all. However, when the police asked who instructed them, they denied it one by one. They just thought David was easy to bully and wanted to collect protection money. During this period, David's parents died in a traffic accident. Zhang Hui kept belittling David in class, insulting his personality and his parents. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore. "Since the investigation has not seen it, I will give him a result." At this time, he also regretted it. He regretted that he had meddled in other people's affairs and regretted investigating everything. One day, in Zhang Hui's class, he was still insulting David, but just when he was getting excited, a bench hit him hard on the head. He was hit and lay on the ground, bleeding profusely. Soon the ambulance and the police came. But when the police took him back, David could no longer speak clearly, his movements became strange, and he had no ability to defend himself. After examination at the hospital, it was found that David had neurological problems and might never recover. David could only go to a mental hospital for recuperation until he was taken away by his relatives. Suddenly, all the memories flooded into David's mind. David, who knew everything, sighed helplessly. "It's really not worth it just because of something like this." David looked at Zhang Hui with a sharp look in his eyes. This kind of person really deserves to die. David then slammed the door and left, leaving Zhang Hui alone, trembling in the office. Chapter 30. Good news. David came out of the gate and stretched. "I don't know what happened to the little guy." David then picked up the phone and prepared to call. Eve was also holding her cell phone at this time, wondering whether or not to call David. She was afraid of disturbing David, so she was wavering on the edge of calling or not. The little white rabbit is so white. Suddenly, the cell phone rang, startling her. The phone in my hand slipped accidentally out of shock and fell on the soft sofa. Eve quickly picked up the phone and saw David's name on the screen. She became nervous and expectant. After the call was connected, David's gentle voice came from the other end. "Have you had breakfast?" David's concern made Eve feel extremely warm. Eve replied shyly, "Yes, I have already eaten." David continued to say with concern, "That's good. I was worried that you didn't see the note I left in your room." Eve replied softly, "How could that be? I saw it all." "Okay, I'll be back soon. You stay at home, okay?" David's voice was full of care and concern. Eve's heartbeat quickened. She said softly and hung up the phone. She sat on the sofa, still holding her cell phone tightly in her hand, as if it could bring her a sense of security. As she thought back to the conversation just now, she couldn't help but feel a warm current welling up in her heart. David's care and advice made her feel extremely warm and happy. Afterwards, David called Wang Gang again. As soon as Wang answered the phone, he heard complaints and angry voices from the other end. "What's wrong with your school? Can teachers stay here?" At this time, Wang Gang was confused and didn't know what had happened to David. Then he quickly asked, "What happened?" David then told Wang Gang what had just happened. After hearing this, Wang Gang was also incredulous. "Is this true? I've never heard of it." "Really? It seems like the school's information is well sealed." "Who is it?" A female voice suddenly came from beside Wang Gang. David was shocked when he heard this. "You're dating? Holy shit, no!" Wang Gang blushed and quickly explained. "Didn't I tell you yesterday that we were going to climb the mountain?" "Really?" David said in a mean way. "What's that tone of voice? We're just in a normal relationship." The girl next to Wang Gang heard this and asked, "Are we really just in a normal relationship?" Then Wang Gang hung up the phone. David heard everything clearly and joked. "I chased my wife to the crematorium. Good luck to you, Wang Gang." David then hailed a taxi and returned home. Downstairs, at this time, the shop was full of people. David was shocked when he saw it because there were no longer elderly people inside, but middle-aged and young people. David looked at this scene, somewhat confused. What happened? It turned out that the day before, David's repairman came to the downtown area by himself, set up a small stall there, and then began to show his skills. He placed Master by Show sign in front of him and laid out some tools. Some passersby asked him to repair their broken items. Originally, they just wanted to give it a try, but when they handed the items to the repairman, they were fixed in no time. More and more people gathered together until the urban management came and drove him away. Before leaving, he gave those people the address of the shop, so there were so many more people in the shop today than usual. As expected of a system, I take back what I said about you being useless. David returned home. He saw a little head staring at him on the sofa as soon as he entered the door. Eve smiled brightly when she saw David coming back. She stood up, walked quickly to David, and asked softly, "You're back." David nodded, looked at her with a smile, and said, "Yeah, I'm back." He reached out his hand, gently ruffled Eve's hair, and said, "You look so happy. Are you thinking about me?" Eve's cheeks flushed slightly. She lowered her head and replied softly, "No." David took Eve's hand and said, "Really?" Eve raised her head and looked into David's eyes, feeling a sweet sensation in her heart. But Eve kept mumbling in her pink little mouth, "I didn't think." But the hand being held did not let go until David noticed something was wrong. "What am I doing? I'm getting more and more proficient at this lately." No. I have to control myself." "Yes, control myself." But just as David was about to let go of Eve's hand, his eyes met Eve's. Their eyes met, and Eve's tender look made David hesitate. At this moment, he felt reluctant, so he changed his mind and said softly, "Forget it. It's not the first time we hold hands." Eve blushed slightly when she heard David's words. She gently held David's hand back, and their hands were tightly clasped again. At this moment, they seemed to feel each other's heartbeats, and that tacit understanding and warmth made them feel extremely happy. David felt the warmth from Eve's little hand, but his own palms were unusually sweaty. This subtle reaction made him feel a little embarrassed. He tried to hide his nervousness, but found that the harder he tried, the more unnatural he seemed. Then David decided to change the subject to ease the awkwardness, so he asked, "By the way, Eve, are you a senior in high school this year?" Eve nodded, then said, "What's wrong?" At this time, David coughed twice, and then said mysteriously, "I have good news to tell you. I wonder if you wanna—" "I want—" David was interrupted by Eve before he could finish his words. "Is that so? Then I'll tell you." Eve nodded, then looked at David with anticipation in her eyes. "Damn it, I'm speechless when being looked at like this," David said in his heart. But Eve kept looking at David with an expectant expression on her face. "Actually, I might be able to go to your school." "Really?" Eve's voice was full of surprise and anticipation. David couldn't help but feel happy when he saw Eve's excitement. He nodded and said seriously, "Yes, as long as I apply to the school, if everything goes well, I should be able to attend classes at your school next semester." "That's really great," Eve said to herself. Chapter 31, Preparing to Return to School. David gently took Eve's hand, walked into the kitchen, and suggested cooking together. "It's almost noon. Let's cook together." Eve gladly accepted the invitation, her heart filled with anticipation and joy. They worked together in the kitchen, Eve washing and chopping vegetables while David cooked. After an hour of busy work, they finally prepared a delicious meal. Looking at the table full of delicious food, Eve felt very proud and satisfied. They enjoyed this lunch together, every bite filled with love and satisfaction. After dinner, David and Eve decided to take a break and enjoy this wonderful moment. At this time, Wang Gang was still chasing the girl from behind. As we all know, when a girl is angry, her movement speed will increase by 50%, so Wang Gang couldn't catch up with her at all. "Sister Mui, wait for me. Let me explain." But Mui still did not stop, but walked even faster. Seeing that the situation was not good, Wang Gang rushed over with all his strength, grabbed Mui, and turned around. Wang Gang said breathlessly, "Just listen to my explanation, okay?" "Okay, I'll give you a chance to explain. Tell me what I just said." Wang Gang scratched his head and said, I just feel that if I admit that it's a date, I'm afraid you will be disgusted. And I'm even more afraid." Seeing Wang Gang hesitant, Mui asked, "What are you afraid of?" "I'm afraid you'll never talk to me again." Mui's mood suddenly improved. "Are you serious? Are you really afraid that I will ignore you?" "Really? I swear to God." "You are sincere. Okay, I will forgive you this time. But is this a date? You still have to show your sincerity." After hearing this, Wang Gang was overjoyed. So you agree with my confession? What confession? I don't know. How can you say this? There's no difference between what I said and confessing my love, Wang Gang said with a hint of coquettishness in his tone. You are a grown man. How can you be like this? I can't see you clearly. I don't care if you agree. I didn't agree. How can anyone express love like this? This is just taking advantage of someone's misfortune. It seems so, but… Then Mui looked at Wang Gang gently. Although I'm a little happy, I still hope you can tell me seriously. I hope you can face this feeling instead of just talking about it. After the rest, David decided to go to school right now. Because of what happened before, it was most likely that David was just taking a leave of absence and was not expelled. If I explain it, maybe I can go back to school, but this time I'm going back not for grades, but to protect her. David then glanced at Eve, who was lying next to him. Then David gently woke Eve up and said, "Will you go to school with me?" Eve rubbed her eyes and sat up, but because she was not awake yet, she fell back into David's arms. The little guy is pretty cute. Then after a long time, Eve woke up from David's arms and rubbed her eyes. What did you just say? Silly, it wasn't just now, it's been an hour. That's right, during this hour, David kept holding Eve in his arms, not moving at all, for fear of disturbing Eve's rest. Eve lost all her sleepiness after hearing this. She quickly sat up and whispered, "I'm sorry. No need to apologize. This is your privilege." After all, for David, this is a reward. Eve got up, changed into casual clothes, and went out with David. Eve had just come downstairs and noticed a new repairman busy at work. David next to her. "Who is the new repairman?" David replied, "Oh, he's the guy I hired recently to help us with some repair work in the shop." Eve thoughtfully suggested, "In that case, can we prepare some delicious food for him next time?" After all, repairmen have a hard job and often feel hungry. David looked at Eve's kind eyes, and a warm feeling welled up in his heart. He smiled and agreed, "Of course." David and Eve then took a taxi to school together. The campus was crowded with people. David noticed that several classmates were gathered together and whispering not far away, looking at him from time to time. "Hey, look, isn't it the girl in our class who is always quiet?" One of them looked at Eve and said, "Really? She sits in the last row of the classroom every day. She always gives people an unattainable feeling, as if she is really great." Another person echoed, "That's right, I heard that she's an orphan, maybe." The third person showed an obscene expression before he finished speaking. David asked Eve to wait for him here for a while, and then he walked straight towards the boys. "Didn't the teacher teach you not to talk about others behind their backs?" The leading boy looked at David and said disdainfully, "Where are you from? You look like a human being. What? Do you want to be a hero and save the beauty? Hey, my, you really are a dog that looks down on people." David again. They were worried that they had offended someone difficult to deal with. But after observing him, they found that the man in front of them was not a prominent figure and continued to mock him. "Who do you think you are? How dare you talk to me like that? Do you know who your father is?" David smiled and said, "Didn't your mom tell you? How pitiful. You." Then, several boys prepared to teach the man in front of them a lesson. But before they could make a move, 3 big slaps hit them on the face, and then they felt a burning pain on their faces. Then, the man punched David in the stomach, but David did not dodge. "Since you fought back, I won't be polite." Then David dragged those people to a secret place and beat them up so badly that they were completely lost. Stop discussing or not. Stop discussing or not. One slap after another hit their faces. "I was wrong. We won't dare to do it again." The 3 men were beaten black and blue by David. "Wrong. I don't believe it." Then David picked up a sharp stone from the ground. "What the hell are you trying to do?" "Ah!" Then a stone hit him, and the man cried out in fear. "Hey, why are you crying? Weren't you quite arrogant just now?" "We were wrong. We really know we were wrong." "Okay, I'll let you go this time. And don't even think about calling the police. I've already recorded your fight back just now. There's no surveillance here, so if the police come, it will be considered a fight at best." "Brother, we know." David then left. Although he knew that this way of handling the matter was not correct, it was the quickest. However, he still hoped that people would call the police as soon as possible when encountering such a thing, rather than fighting violence with violence. The police will help you. Chapter 32, The Culprit. After dealing with those things, David returned to Eve, but found that she was not in the original place. A feeling of uneasiness suddenly came over him. He thought of the discussions and ridicule Eve had suffered before, and he couldn't help feeling panicked. David looked everywhere for Eve. He ran all over the campus and asked many people, but still couldn't find any trace of Eve. His mood became increasingly heavy, and his heart was filled with worry and anxiety. Just when he was about to give up, he finally found Eve under an old tree in the school. She was sitting in a chair under a tree, swaying and dozing off. The sunlight shone onto her through the gaps in the leaves, giving her a golden halo. David walked gently to Eve, squatted down, and gently woke her up. Eve slowly opened her eyes and saw David's concerned look. A hint of emotion flashed in her eyes. "Didn't I tell you to wait for me there? Why are you here?" David asked, his tone full of worry. Eve was silent for a while before she spoke. I don't want to go in. It's too noisy there. I want to be alone." David couldn't help but feel distressed after hearing what Eve said. He knew that Eve had been through a lot, and what she needed was not just comfort and companionship, but also understanding and support. So, David gently hugged Eve and let her lean on his shoulder. He gently stroked her hair and said softly, "Then let's take a rest first?" Eve shook her head and said weakly, "It's okay. Your business is more important." There was a firmness in her eyes, as if she didn't want David to be distracted by her. David looked at Eve's tired but determined face and couldn't help feeling guilty. He knew that Eve was pretending to be strong in order not to make him worry, but he knew even more clearly that what Eve needed now was rest and relaxation. "It's okay, Eve," David comforted softly. "Just for a little while, let me stay with you." He gently helped Eve sit down, then sat beside her, quietly guarding her. But Eve stood up, took David's hand, and said, "It's okay. I'm okay now." "Really?" David asked worriedly. Later, David and Eve walked into the teaching building, but he didn't know where the principal's office was. Then David asked Eve, "Do you know where the principal's office is?" Eve shook her head and said, "I've only been in the classroom, the office, and the toilet." Toilet. David thought of some reasons at this time, but he swallowed his words back. He didn't want to mention Eve's past for fear of hurting her. Although she was fine at home, the psychological thoughts were different in different environments. After all, this school is also a part of her miserable life. Just when David didn't know what to do, a tall girl walked up to him. "Hello, we meet again." David looked up and down at the girl in front of him, and for a moment, he couldn't remember who she was. "Excuse me, who are you? Have you forgotten so quickly?" "I'm the girl you asked for directions this morning." Suddenly, David was enlightened. "It turned out to be you, right? So what is the purpose of coming to school this time?" But David was thinking, why would such a cool girl come to me? Is she trying to suppress me in disguise? Let others see me talking to her, and then be jealous and hate me, and finally make me a rat crossing the street in the school. What a vicious woman. However, that was not the case. Bairan just saw that he looked sad, so she went forward to see if there was any help she could provide. "No, nothing happened." David pretended to be calm. "Since there's nothing else, I'll leave." At this moment, David felt his hand being tightly grasped by something, and the force was getting tighter and tighter. David looked at Eve and found that Eve's face was puffy and she seemed angry. "Is this little guy jealous? I really shouldn't have asked a girl for directions. Damn it." Then David touched Eve's little head and said gently, "Don't worry, she and I have nothing to do with each other." "Really?" Seeing Eve's mood improve a little, David immediately said with a solemn oath, "Of course. I would never lie to you, even if I lie to anyone else. I trust you once." David breathed a sigh of relief and thought to himself, "That's great." After David and Eve's hard work, they finally found the principal's office. But just as I arrived at the principal's office, I heard a voice coming from inside, and there was obviously a hint of anger in the voice. "Fan Yen, you are becoming more and more outrageous. I recruited you here to teach and educate people, not to let you come here to accept gifts." "Accepting gifts? That's going to be fun." But at this time, David glanced at Eve, and there was a hint of fear and timidity in her eyes. She held David's hand tightly and leaned against David consciously. "So that's how it is." He understood everything now. A female voice was heard from the principal's office. "Principal, I'm just accepting a gift. What's so excessive about that?" After hearing this, the principal's face suddenly changed. David and Eve looked at each other and saw a hint of worry in each other's eyes. They knew that this matter might be much more complicated than they imagined. David comforted Eve softly. "Don't be afraid. I'm here. Let's listen to what the principal has to say first." Eve nodded, but her hand still tightly held David's hand, as if seeking a sense of security. The noises from the office continued, and the principal's tone became increasingly severe. "Fan Yin, you are challenging my bottom line. If you continue like this, I will have no choice but to expel you from school." Fan Yin didn't seem to care after hearing this. She snorted coldly. "Fire? Do you think I care? I'm tired of this shabby place." The principal was so angry that he slammed the table. His voice was deafening. "You! You are simply lawless. I will not let you go." Just then, the office door suddenly opened and David and Eve walked in. When the principal saw them, he was stunned for a moment, while Fan Yin looked disdainful. "It's you." Fan Yin looked at Eve sarcastically. David glanced at her and did not answer her. Instead, he said directly to the principal, "Principal, I have something to talk to you about." The principal was still angry at this time and didn't want to pay any attention to David. "Get out! Do you understand the ways of the world?" David sneered in his heart, but remained respectful and flattering on the surface. "Principal, I actually wanted to come and talk to you about returning to school." "Return to school?" The principal was puzzled for a moment, then said, "We don't have any students on leave here." Chapter 33, Return to School. But David said it very seriously. "I think the school should have the information. How about you check it out?" But the principal still said, "I don't have any students who are on leave." "Really? Do you know about that incident 3 years ago?" "3 years ago?" The principal stroked his beard. Suddenly his pupils dilated, and he started fiddling with the computer. Then he found information about the incident 3 years ago. Then he stood in front of David and looked at the young man carefully. David is a rare genius in Shinkong City's #1 middle school, but he eventually left the school because of certain things. The principal's tone improved as he spoke. He then took out a piece of paper from behind and handed it to David. "Here, it's just an application form for returning to school. Just fill it out." David looked at the principal in surprise. "Is it that simple? Otherwise, after all, it wasn't your fault. Now that you've recovered, come back to class." "Thank you. It's okay, it's just a small favor. As for the teacher at that time, he will no longer teach in this school. I will improve the environment here. It's a shame for the education community that a #1 middle school is so filthy." Seeing the principal in front of him with such a strong sense of justice, David pulled him aside and told him something about Eve. After hearing this, the principal's face changed drastically. He couldn't believe that such a thing happened during his tenure, and that he had even recruited that teacher. "Don't worry, I will definitely give her justice." David and Eve had just left the principal's office when they ran into 3 women who were the ones who had clashed with David outside. Enemies always meet on a narrow road. "Last time we suffered a loss outside, and this time at school, I see you are going against us," one of the women mocked. David ignored them, but took Eve's hand and asked gently, "Do you want to go out and try something different today?" "As you say," Eve replied obediently. However, the people in front of them were not happy. One of the women rushed forward and tried to hit David. David was quick and grabbed her wrist. "What do you want to do?" David asked coldly. "What do we want to do? You almost got us caught last time, and now you want to act wild here again today?" the woman said angrily. David released her wrist and said calmly, "Did you ask for that?" "I actually laughed." "Stop lecturing us here. We will make you pay the price today," another woman shouted. David looked at them and said to Eve, "Eve, let's go." Eve nodded, and the two turned to leave, but the women refused to let them go and chased after them. At this moment, the school security guards heard the noise and rushed over. They saw David and Eve, as well as the women who were causing the trouble, and immediately understood what was going on. The security captain walked up to David and Eve and asked, "Are you okay?" David shook his head. "We are fine, thank you." The security captain nodded, then turned to the girls and said seriously, "You are causing trouble in school and have violated school rules. I suggest you leave immediately, otherwise we will have to take action." When the women saw the security guards coming, they taunted them. "I'm a student of this school. You can't catch me." It turns out there are such brainless people in this school. The security guards then controlled all 3 of them, and just as they did so, the principal arrived. "Principal, why are you here?" "Leave this to us," said the security captain. But the principal waved his hand and signaled them to let the 3 people go. Before the security captain could finish, the principal said, "I have my own plans." The security guard had no choice but to let them go. After letting them go, the woman became even more arrogant. "How dare you arrest us? You have no eyes." But the principal said sternly, "You 3 have seriously violated the school rules. I will expel you and call you in on the first day of school." The principal's words were like a bolt from the blue, leaving the 3 women stunned. They didn't expect that their actions would lead to such serious consequences. For a moment, there was complete silence at the gate. with only the principal's serious voice echoing in the air. "Principal, we were wrong." One of the girls broke the silence first. Her voice was trembling and a little tearful. "We shouldn't have caused trouble in school, and we shouldn't have done that to him and Eve." The principal looked at them with disappointment and anger in his eyes. "Your behavior has seriously affected the normal order of the school and damaged the reputation of the school. I cannot tolerate such things happening, let alone let you continue to stay in the school." Another woman burst into tears. "Principal, we know we were wrong. Please give us a chance to correct our mistakes. We will work hard to make up for our mistakes and never let you down again." The principal was silent for a while, then sighed. "Opportunities always come to those who are prepared. Your mistake this time is irreversible, but I hope you can remember this lesson and not make the same mistake again in the future." After hearing the principal's words, the three girls lowered their heads, their hearts filled with regret and self-blame. They knew that this mistake had cost them a valuable learning opportunity and had left an indelible stain on their lives. David and Eve stood aside, watching the miserable appearance of the three women, and could not help but feel a sense of emotion in their hearts. They knew that this incident was not only a punishment for the three women, but also a warning to everyone. In school, they should abide by the rules, respect others, and work together to create a harmonious and beautiful learning environment. Let's go eat something good." David looked at Eve gently. "Okay." Eve's face was filled with smiles. Then they came to a hot pot restaurant, which was very lively and filled with fragrance. David and Eve found a seat and sat down and ordered a few dishes they liked. The hot pot was served quickly. The steaming soup was rolling in the pot, and various ingredients were rolling in the soup, exuding an enticing aroma. David picked up the chopsticks, picked up a piece of tender meat, and put it into the pot, then handed Eve a pair of chopsticks. "Come on, try this," David said with a smile. Eve took the chopsticks, picked up a piece of meat, and put it in her mouth, savoring it carefully. A satisfied expression appeared on her face, and she said to David, "It's delicious." The two chatted while enjoying the food, and the atmosphere was very pleasant. After finishing the hot pot, David and Eve walked out of the restaurant. Night had fallen, the lights were on, and the trees on both sides of the street were shining green under the lights. They strolled on the street, enjoying the tranquility and beauty of the night. "I'm very happy today. Thank you," Eve muttered softly. David gently held Eve's hand and said with a smile, "I'm also very happy because you are by my side." The two continued to stroll until night fell. Then they returned home. This day was full of sweetness and warmth for David and Eve. They knew that as long as they were with each other, the days to come would be even better. Chapter 34, Justice. The next day. Ding-ling-ling. Ding-ling-ling. Early in the morning, David's cell phone rang. David was awakened by the ringing of the phone. "Earthquake! Earthquake!" David sat up hurriedly and prepared to pick up Eve and take her away. But then David didn't feel any vibration. David patted his chest and said, "It was just a false alarm, just a false alarm." Then David came outside, picked up the phone, and asked, "What's wrong? Why are you on a plane so early in the morning?" "Big news! A teacher was fired from the school," Wang Gang said in shock. "Open? Just open it. He's not a good guy anyway. He can't teach anyone if he stays in school." David asked calmly. "But this is not the point. The point is that someone went in." Wang Gang continued. David was a little confused at this point and asked, "Huh? Go in? Oh, it seems to be your previous homeroom teacher. I don't know what he did wrong, but he was put in jail anyway." David was secretly happy. "I should have gone in a long time ago. I don't know why I waited until now." "Really? That's good. Although I don't know the reason. The police will definitely not arrest the wrong person." "That's true. Since there's nothing else to do, I won't bother you anymore. By the way." Then Wang Gang hung up the phone. "Oh, you said that as if I were busy with something. Forget it. Now that we're up, let's prepare breakfast." Then David prepared breakfast as usual and went to the room to wake Eve up to eat. Back in the room, the morning sunlight shines through the gaps in the curtains and into the corners of the room, adding a bit of warmth to this quiet space. Eve lay quietly on the bed, her long hair casually scattered on the pillow. The breeze blew, and a few strands of hair fluttered gently, adding a bit of softness to her. Her face was delicate and her skin was fair, with a natural rosy complexion. Her eyes were tightly closed, and her thick eyelashes trembled slightly, as if she was telling a sweet dream. Her body was tightly wrapped in a soft quilt with elegant colors and simple patterns, which complemented her temperament. Her hands rested lightly on the quilt. Her fingers were slender and long, making people want to gently hold her up. She has a petite figure with beautiful curves, and every detail seems to reveal the feminine beauty and charm. Eve's breathing was steady and deep, with slight snorting sounds, as if expressing her peace and tranquility. Her chest rose and fell gently, swaying slightly with the rhythm of her breathing, adding a bit of liveliness and energy to her. Her legs were bent naturally, and her feet were gently curled, as if she was enjoying this rare moment of tranquility. The little guy is sleeping soundly. David walked carefully to Eve's side and gazed at her sleeping face with soft eyes. He reached out and gently pinched Eve's fair and soft cheek, feeling the warmth and softness brought by that delicate skin. Soft and cute, he whispered to himself, a gentle smile on his lips. However, David couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. He was worried that his actions would disturb Eve's sleep or make her unhappy. He carefully observed Eve's reaction and saw that her brows were slightly frowned, as if she felt something strange in her dream. At this moment, Eve suddenly bit David's finger gently. Although her movements were gentle, they caused David's body to tremble. "Oh my God, this isn't candy." But when David was about to take his fingers back, Eve bit even harder. She mumbled, "Why, candy move?" David looked at Eve lovingly and said, "So you want to eat candy? I'll buy it for you later, but you have to take it back now. Otherwise, it will be hard to explain when you wake up." Then David gently applied force, and just when his finger was about to be withdrawn, Eve woke up and they looked at each other. The room suddenly became quiet at this moment, so quiet that the only sound could be heard was David's 180-beat heartbeat. "Eve, let me explain to you." David couldn't speak clearly at this time. It was the first time he experienced such a thing, but Eve's soft tongue stroked David's fingers a few times. "Sweet." Suddenly, a drop of blood flowed from David's nostril. He wiped his nose with his other hand. His heart beat faster when he saw the blood. David immediately pulled out his fingers and rushed into the bathroom, telling Eve as he ran, "Breakfast is on the table. Don't forget to eat." Because David might really stay in the bathroom alone for a while, he had to tell Eve in advance. After David left, Eve licked her lips, savoring the taste. Then she said to herself, "I'll try again next time." When Eve got up and prepared to wash up, David was still in the bathroom, so she had to make do in the kitchen. David was in the bathroom, feeling his heart. The sudden incident caught him off guard, causing his heart rate to fail to drop. What was that just now? David touched his face, which was extremely hot. Then he stood in front of the mirror. His face had turned into a red apple, and the heat was fading very slowly. At this point, David couldn't help but wonder, did she wake up when I pinched her face? What happened after that? Was it intentional? David quickly shook his head. No way, no way. How could such a thing happen? It must have been an accident. The sweetness he ate must have been the sweetness of the buns. But David then put Eve's bitten finger into his mouth and tasted it carefully. It has no taste. But suddenly he reacted. "I seem to have forgotten to wash my hands." David then slapped himself twice. "I am such a jerk. I took advantage of this. Am I really a pervert?" He looked at himself in disbelief, then thought of what had just happened, and his heart couldn't help but beat faster. Eve had already eaten half of the breakfast prepared by David and left the other half for David. David had been in the bathroom for half an hour. He saw that his face was gradually returning to normal, and his heart slowly calmed down. It's finally healed. Then David walked out of the bathroom and saw Eve standing at the door. "Eve, you..." David could finish his words. Eve ran in. David was stunned for a moment. Then he understood what Eve wanted to do. He smiled and thought that the girl was so cute, and the shame he had just felt disappeared in an instant. He walked over to where Eve had just stood and found that she had actually left a note. It said, "You are not allowed to stay so long." Although the handwriting was a little sloppy, it was full of Eve's personality. David looked at the note and felt a little sorry. "Let's go to a different place next time." Then he put away the note and went to the living room to finish the other half of the breakfast that Eve left behind.